It's 9 o'clock. It's Thursday, August 10th. We are here for the Fort Myers Beach Management and Planning session. I'm going to call the meeting to order. We have the town manager, the town attorney, the town clerk, Councilors King, Woodson, Veach, and Vice Mayor Adderholt are here this morning. The mayor has an excused absence. He is at a congressional hearing. It's an oversight hearing on FEMA's performance post-Ian. And he will be at the hearing, and then he will be giving a personal tour of the congressional delegation from the committee after the meeting. He'll have a chance to personally convey the town's thoughts and concerns about FEMA's performance post-Ian. So he is in a very important place, and we wish him well in his endeavors this morning. If we could all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Appreciate the talent you guys bring to the table in a time when we really need this kind of knowledge.
Thank you. I'm Kathy Turner, and proudly representing the Estero Island Garden Club. The club, just by a little bit of background, has been around since 1959, and 80% of our membership has renewed their membership after post-Ian, and many of them are displaced all over the country. So we think that's a statement towards what our club brings. Today, we focus on education, conservation, serving the gardening community. We provide resources and opportunities for civic and environmental responsibility. Our website, which is partially open to the public, has a multitude of reference material. So without being a member, you can go to the website and see some of the presentations we've had in the past. We collaborate with commercial, institutional entities as they develop their landscape opportunity. We're trying to get a foot in the door with Margaritaville. They have their own landscape architect. We think that they could actually be a tremendous example to the town on landscape in our area. We plan in the fall to invite the town and the community to a group presentation on the basic principles and examples in choosing the right plant for the right place and at the right time. So that'll be open, and we will get with the town to get it on the calendar and invite the community. We're not in a position to do individual site visits with the community at this point, but we are looking to get that information out. Our meetings have been open to the public, and once a month we host a guest speaker on vegetation topics. We will have our first meeting post-Ian in November at the Mound House. We hope to eventually return back to the library when they are open. We have been responsible for maintaining many gardens which sadly are gone, except for a memorial garden over at Bay Oaks Recreation Building. We've cleaned that garden up, which surprisingly a good portion of it survived with the native plants, and we were planning on sprucing it up in the fall. But we heard from the town manager that he has some vision for that area, so we want to make sure we're not wasting our time and effort. And we'll collaborate with you and Jeff as far as what we do with that particular area. It's very important because it was an endowment provided by a former member. It was funded by that. We still have a little funds left. So we want to make sure it's in the right place and doesn't interfere with whatever you do with Bay Oaks Recreation Building, but also serves to beautify that area. So in a multitude of meetings that I've heard, EIG, Estero Island Garden Club, has been referred to at Town Council, at M&P meetings, at the LPA, and at MRF. And we would happy to serve as an advisor to the town staff, and the advisory committees, however you see we can fit in. It would be a mutual benefit because some of our members need something to hang on to right now. They're displaced. They're suddenly back in the workforce to pay for assessments, and this is something that they're very passionate and knowledgeable about. We have a considerable amount of local expertise. We have a number of professional contacts with whom we consult. We have a few master gardeners. One of them is Rose Larkin, who's on MRF, and who I and the board collaborate, almost every day. Our gardeners are excited to participate in the beautification of the island. you know, how you see we fit in. It can be as simple as you've got a proposal by a landscape company to do X, Y, Z. Does this look right to you? You know, we can comment on the plantings. And some of the activities we've seen in the past, your landscaper did what was in their best interest, not necessarily in the town's best interest. You know, for instance, that little patch between the curb and the sidewalk on Estero. Way too many perennial peanut plants, not our choice, and we didn't think it was properly installed. You know, we saw the town staff out there, unfortunately, weeding by hand after the planting. So we're here for you. Just let us know how you think we can fit in. We're not able to provide any labor as a club. We have individual members that may volunteer, and I would welcome a copy of the waiver that we can put on our site and direct people. Like a lot of the organizations, we're aging up, and we need to build up with the extenuating conditions with some of the plantings. We did the whale garden, the garden in front of the whale. We planted in May, and we had a really robust group that was out there planting. And by the end, there was probably 6 of us left. It was May. There's brutal. There was no shade. And it was constantly, okay, you need to go sit in the car or you need to go home. So we're very conscious of that. We leave that up to the individual, the decision, but the club itself cannot say, okay, we will do this for the town. Our club is not a 501c3. We charge dues just about enough to cover our operating expenses. We have done fundraising in the past, but some of that hasn't happened since Postain. So any projects that we assist with, we would be happy to fundraise, you know, happy to get in touch with the Women's Club, the Community Foundation, Beach Talk Radio, and to assist us in these endeavors, you know, and taking the burden off the town as far as funding, which probably isn't your priority right now. So some thoughts on how we can begin beautifying with vegetation. How about adopting a block revitalization with vegetation? You know, a campaign along Estero Boulevard where you have that strip of land between the curb and the street. Look for volunteers in the area who are either residents or commercial that want to adopt and assist with getting that planted and assist with the weeding and the maintenance of that area. And to that, we would look to the town to help us out to water. Even native plants need to be watered regularly to be established, and that can last up to a year. We were about a year into it, I think, Bill, that really the heavy watering took place down at the whale. And the best. Okay, the other idea is to adopt a beach access revitalization with a vegetation campaign. Now, what you probably don't know is a lot of those beach accesses were actually planted by the Garden Club many years ago. A lot of the sea grapes that you see there were planted by the Garden Club. So again, in a supervisory, we need help type of position, we could advise what to be planted, get it cleaned up. Some modest cleanup work, you know, we're probably happy to do. And that really could boost some of the greenery and the feel good on getting to the beach. For your town property, we recommend at least 75% all native and 25% Florida friendly. We do not recommend plants that are not accustomed to weather in Southwest Florida. I call them northern plants. You know, no begonias, no sun impatiens, because they're still not acclimated to the Florida sun. And I guess the best advice I can give you is to survey the island right now. A lot of our landscapes have not been rejuvenated. You can see what survived. And that was probably the best advice when I moved down here 5 years ago, is drive around. You know, because whatever happens in Miami doesn't actually do well here. And even from here to Marco or here to Sanibel, the environment is slightly different. So that's the best advice as far as what actually did well. And some of that will includes both native and Florida friendly. I have Ixora, and I have some variegated hibiscus, which have done tremendous. And they have had no care since Hurricane Ian. I have not watered, fertilized, paid any attention to them. They're just there because we've had so many other priorities.
And the Dune sunflowers have become like the
Oh, they're out of
poster
control.
child for the beach.
Yes, yes. Well, they're getting old now, I think. They're like yo high. We also have some periwinkle, where I don't know where they came from, and they're growing tremendously. So I guess they didn't care about the salt. We generally don't recommend plantings in pots because they require more maintenance and more water. You know, a little while back, the town planted in pots on Palm Ave by the new restrooms that they put in at that time. And it was January, and it was begonias, and it was impatiens. And over the next month, we just watched them die. So we're confident that with our advice, we can assist the town and its community in beautifying the island, and vegetation taking less time, less effort, costing less, and producing long-lasting vegetation. Any questions?
First of all, thank you for being here, Kathy. Thank you for all that you and your organization do. I had a couple quick questions. Could you give some advice? Obviously, we had a massive storm surge of salt water that went over the island. As various condo associations and homes and businesses are looking at landscaping, is there any advice you'd give in terms of how long they wait as a result of the salt water getting over the island? Is there even a need to wait? What's the impact of that salt water on the land here on Fort Myers Beach?
My answer is conservative. I'm waiting until after the rainy season. I still have muck that's visible in my yard. The landscapers have hand raked that 3 times. And I'm not looking to plant and just have it not tolerate the salt. The Sanibel Captiva Foundation has put out guidelines on when to do that and how to remediate the grounds. This was way back. This was back in December. They were talking about you need to break up the top so many inches of soil, and then you had to have so many inches of new soil on top of that and mix it well. And I was like, I can't do this. But there are ways to do it sooner. You've probably seen on the island where you have a landscaper that comes in that just plants and puts rocks over it and says, goodbye, here's my bill. And that's not what we're advising. That muck has to get out of there one way or the other, or be neutralized. The salinity should be just about out of the soil. But again, it's very specific. Your yard could be different from my yard.
But the storm surge had a profound impact on the soil,
Absolutely.
and you're hoping that the rainy season will dilute that as we get through the rainy season?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And there are some, recommendations. You can start doing that now. I'm just being more conservative. I'm not going to do that for another month or so.
Kathy, if you could, the plantings that occurred along Estero Boulevard prior to Ian, just as you had said, they seem to have struggled.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way your organization, and you've offered it this morning, I see our Public Works Director here, Jason Freeman, you could sit down with our team and put together some ideas for because we have, the county gave Fort Myers Beach a significant amount of funds to help plant vegetation and maintain that vegetation. And we want to use that wisely, but it seems like what we were planning before, and I know it was in its infancy, but some advice about how we could do better on that as we replant Estero, because it's so grim out there.
Well, they planted sunshine mimosa, which would be my choice. They just didn't do it properly. It's like they didn't dig down and really set those plants in the ground.
And I will say that somewhere where there's sunshine mimosa, it's coming back. I noticed
Yes,
a couple
that's
of
correct.
strips. It's full of other weeds.
Yes.
But it's got it's very established.
Yeah, that was definitely much more conducive to the situation. I haven't seen any perennial peanut
Yeah.
back up. But yeah, we walk that road all the time and walk the beach, and we were watching the plantings, and it's like, oh my goodness.
So, one thing that needs to be eliminating, and kind of getting to what the Vice Mayor was saying, is that right now, my understanding of most people's limitations with planting is that they're still going to be doing a lot of construction.
Mhm.
And the construction will devastate a lot of plantings,
Right.
because it's a big job.
Mhm.
And I think that as you go down a particular street, you'll see that at the bay side of the street, there's houses, at the Gulf side, there's nothing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we've discussed, like, the planting now, because certainly we needed to give the residents along Estero a little heads up. Because it became a repository for the trash cans and the palm fronds, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a dilemma because they don't have the driveway footage to put their cans and all that in the driveway and still get a car out of there in some cases. So it's something, with a heads up and suggestions and being, forthright on what we're doing and cooperate with us while we get this done. That's why the Adopt a Block, I think, will really help you, because you'll have people on that block invested to say, okay, come on, let's do it like this instead of like that.
Now, when we did the whale, a big part of it was also the design,
Right?
right?
Absolutely.
Now, is there something the club would be willing to do if we generate even simple maps or planting areas in a beach access to do the design and give some advice on how to plant? Because I know, like in the whale, we use the cardboard as a layer,
Right.
which was some work, but it was very effective at keeping the weeds back.
Absolutely. So we have the experts, and I'm a novice. I'm learning, and I know how to reach out to the true experts in our club. But certainly, we have Rose, we have Branda, we have a number of people that have gone through the designing principles, Paula. So yes, we can provide you with that basic information. And I'm the cheerleader, so I'll get you whoever you need to be participating.
Any other questions for Kathy?
As one last comment,
Please, go ahead.
you've been provided with the introduction to Florida native plants from Murph, from Rose Larkin. So you should have that. It's on our website. I'm not sure where it is on town councils, but Rose said it was provided to you. And the other thing is, in your newsletter the last couple of weeks has been, please use native plants as you were rebuilding. And there's from the Marine Environmental Task Force, and that provides information on why you should use native plants.
Kathy, just since you have the floor, and a lot of people watch this, do you want to just give a little synopsis as to why native plants are important?
They require less of everything. So we're here first, and they know how to survive here. They need less water, if any additional watering. They don't need fertilizer. They don't need pesticides. They live in concert with other plantings. As I said before, there's a few Florida-friendly plants that I've neglected and have done okay, but that's not necessarily the norm. It's the ones who belong here who do the best. So it saves you time, effort, and money.
And I'll iterate, because one thing Ian taught us is what survives. Because and I understand this was a garden club planting along the Connecticut Street beach access, where there was a hedge
Right.
of very healthy sea grapes.
Right.
After the storm, they were laying down the ground. They had their root balls exposed. They looked completely dead. Within a matter of days,
Yeah.
they were putting up shoots. And now, except for the lean, you would barely notice.
Yeah.
They withstood that test.
Yep. So, and, I forgot to mention, thank you, Andy, for the replacement of coconut palms in Bayside Park. We only hope that you can figure out a way to get rid of the artificial turf, the plastic getting into the bay.
And I'll also point out, one really good thing about that we get out of native plants is they're host plants for butterflies and bees.
Right.
And our yard, when we got it established before the storm, it was alive with butterflies. And that is a real big treat.
I have a couple cards here. If you didn't have them from last time, I'll leave them from Amy for contact information. We're on Facebook. We have our website, which has some reference material. We welcome new members. I think somebody on Murph is going to join our club through this activity. So come learn. We're a fun group of people.
Very
Yep.
good, Kathy.
And before
All
Kathy
right.
moves, just as kind of a takeaway from this, is council agreeable to having Public Works work with the garden club and redesigning the plants to go back into beach accesses?
Sure, absolutely.
Totally.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks again, Kathy. Next on the agenda is the presentation of the 23-24 budget. I'll introduce our town manager to introduce our finance director. And I, just by way of background, I would say that to Joe we were blessed to have Joe give us all individual briefings on this budget this past week, and that was very helpful. So as Joe presents, I'm going to encourage you to present in a way that's user-friendly to the general public who often watch these hearings. So welcome, Joe, and Andy, if you want to introduce this, or we'll go right to Joe.
We can just go straight to Joe.
Say your name and position, Joe.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Joe Onzek, and I'm the Director of Finance for the town of Fort Myers Beach. Okay, so I prepared this presentation that just gives you some highlights regarding the 2023-24 budget that we're in the process of putting together. What this presentation will cover is I just wanted to touch on each of these topics, what the budget process has been and its challenges, the revenue loss and uncertainty of financial assistance, additional personnel that have been needed to support recovery, the resulting budget in total, a summary of changes between the FY23 and 24 budgets, the general fund budget by department, the funding strategy for the general fund budget, and then the special revenue fund budgets. Regarding the budget process, it's really very simple in a way. It's the finance department has worked with each of the department heads and the town manager to compile what we think is a realistic budget that is required to support the services and programs of the town. And the proposed budget also is a reflection of the extraordinary amount of personnel and financial resources that are required to support the recovery effort, as well as the impact of the challenges the town is facing. So just to touch on some of these challenges, of course we have the significant loss of revenue, we have uncertainty of funding for disaster recovery, and I'll give a tiny bit more detail on each of these as we move along, but this is just a summary of these challenges. And of course we have the desire to maintain the millage rate as it is. The inflation that we're experiencing recently logged at 7.3% for the Tampa St. Pete area, which is the closest area to us in which there's a specific figure available. We also have the challenge of attracting and retaining qualified personnel. And then we had, of course, additional personnel that was needed to support the recovery. The major revenue loss, we've lost $2,758,000,000 worth of taxable property due to Hurricane Ian's destruction, and that has resulted in an expected loss of $1.8 million of revenue, so a 42.6% loss of revenue that will be collected next year as a result of the loss of taxable property. Compounding the loss of property tax revenue is a $1.6 million loss of parking revenue and other revenues due to the related reduction in tourism. By uncertainty of funding to support disaster recovery, what I'm referring to here is, although there are efforts underway which we greatly appreciate to provide federal and state assistance to the town, such as FEMA reimbursements, the Community Disaster Loan, CDBGR, DR, state appropriation, Resiliently, etc., the uncertainty of the timing and the amounts of assistance makes it difficult to incorporate it into the budget. So therefore, what we've only incorporated into the budget that we're currently working on is what we've actually received, and that is the proceeds from the Emergency Bridge Loan and the American Rescue Plan Act. We have not even addressed in the budget any of the cost of rebuilding and those projects. They'll be addressed on a project-by-project basis going forward. And of course, the other challenge is that we're proposing to keep the millage rate the same for 2024 as it was in 2023, and that's at 0.99. We have seen a significant increase in personnel that has been required since the original FY23 budget, and all of these positions have been added to support the town in its recovery efforts, and also just to help it survive in its operational, from an operational standpoint going forward. So within, and what I have here is I have the fund listed on the left side. Actually, I should have updated the last couple of fund identifiers at the bottom left corner. What you're seeing on this entire slide is everything that's in the general fund in the current version of the budget. And so it's just a list of new positions that were added: the Director of Operations and Compliance, Executive Assistant to the Town Manager, Human Resource Manager, or Systems Administrator. It was previously a contracted position, now brought on as a full-time employee. We have a Community Development Director, Planning and Zoning Manager, Senior Zoning and Permitting Technician, Code Compliance Manager, Compliance Officer, Maintenance Worker. So those are some of the positions that were added. Some of these had been previously contracted, some are brand new, and they were all needed at this point to help support disaster recovery. So it's a total of 12 positions.
And so the way you're talking there, Joe, so you anticipating that these are not long-term positions? These are just while we're recovering from the storm?
Well, it remains to be seen. I mean, for the foreseeable future, they are certainly needed, and it's possible as some of these will probably drop back, especially in the building permit area, whereas that workload decreases. But for the next few years at least, we'll be seeing that need, and we'll reevaluate on a yearly basis as to what's needed. This slide here is we have one additional stormwater utility tech. But then the remaining positions here are all within the building fund. They're related to the permitting activities that are being supported now. And that total is 16.5 new positions. All of these positions are being paid for by the additional permit revenue that's coming in. So it's a total of 29.5 positions, and most of these were added to help the residents in what they're trying to accomplish. And to help support the workload that is currently staggering. Trying to get it to go forward here.
And again, Joe, a couple of these were also contracted out positions that we brought in-house.
Yes, and I believe, Steve could probably explain that better, but certainly like the residential inspectors and the building examiner, permitting technicians, some of these things have been contracted out, and so this is an effort to bring these people on.
And even the Community Development Director position was contracted out prior, correct?
I believe so.
I think that's correct, yeah.
I'm sorry, I cannot get this to go forward. Should I be aiming it at a different direction? Uh-oh. Well, while we're waiting, I'll go ahead in my own presentation and see if I can just hit the highlights until it comes back up.
It's important to be able to improvise.
Yes. Okay, so I apologize you can't actually see it, but the next thing I was going to touch on is the total amount of the general fund budget is $12.3 million. And the total amount of all of the funds combined is $53 million. If we focus on the general fund, which is what is being supported by the property tax revenue, other revenues generated, as well as parking revenue, the difference between the 2024 budget and the 2023 budget, so from year to year, the budget actually decreased. And the reason for that is that in 2024, well, I should say in 2023, we transferred $4 million into the capital fund. So there's a $4 million the current year FY23 budget is enough funding to get that caught up as well. So part of it is a catch up, and part of it is to fund initial initiatives by the town council.
So, I mean, so you have a fund that and I understand, you put money into a fund regularly so that when you need to replace a
Yes.
pickup truck, you don't have
Yes.
to dig into somewhere else. But then there's also our projects like Bay Oaks, Times Square,
Yes.
and those are essentially on hold now?
Well, they're not necessarily on hold, because so much of that has been destroyed or damaged. Now the funding that's going to replace that, to rebuild that, to repair that is coming from FEMA, from insurance, so it's just a different source of funding. And so whatever has been put into the capital fund will remain there for future improvements. But what is taking place now in terms of projects, what those funding sources are, have significantly changed. The town will still have its share, but hopefully a very small share of those expenses, and that's partly what we need to work through as we move forward with each project on a project-by-project basis. So it looks like I've got the screen back up. So here's the total amounts of the budget that I had referenced, and then this is the difference. Focusing just on the general fund, it's a $2 million decrease. And then this starts into the explanation of what makes up that $2 million difference. So we're starting with that $4 million reduction in the transfer to the capital fund. Also, since the facilities for Bay Oaks primarily is not up and running and will not be up and running and fully until into next year, there are several vacancies that will be carried forward into next year. And so the savings from those vacancies equates to $383,000. That's just temporary, because once everything is up and running fully, that expense will come back. But for next year, we're seeing that reduction. There is also, as a result of changing health insurance providers, as being proposed, the impact on the general fund is a $27,000 savings. There's a decrease in utilities budget that's really related to the reduction in the operations of the facilities themselves. We don't have as many facilities to be operating. So even though there have been increases in utility rates, the amount of facility square footage is reduced. We have telephone, cell phone, internet expense reduction, and that's the result of going more towards cell phone usage rather than landlines, and other cost savings that have been negotiated. And then we have an overall decrease in postage as a result of switching to more electronic means of communication. And then at the bottom of this list, this is where we see the cost of the 12 new positions that were added to the general fund budget, and that's at $1,061,000. Then we have an estimated increase in liability insurance. They estimated it would double. We don't think that is the case, but we're still using that figure for now until we have a final figure. We're also incorporating into the budget a 2% contingency. This did not really exist. There was a contingency line item, but it was being used for other things. It wasn't a true contingency. So I've separated out a true contingency of 2%. It's not very much, but it is a standard amount that's used by many municipalities, and that's $240,000. There is an expense for leaving Benecom, which is being proposed. Benecom is our insurance provider currently. And this $175,000 would cover the estimated cost of any remaining claims that may be trickling through that were incurred prior to leaving Benecon, but now need to be paid out. And so this is an estimate of what that will cost. There's a budget.
And Joe, we're going to get to this, but
Yes.
Benecon is an insurance pool of municipalities, correct? And we're in essence going to move towards a self-insurance direction. Is that fair?
I think that's a fair summary of that, and it'll be explained in detail in the following presentation.
Very good. Thank you.
Sure. Also, there's a budget for $110,000 for vehicles within the general fund. There's an overall increase in the variety of contractual services that the town has. The increase in total is almost 94,000. We then have a provision within the budget to support the recommendation from the Evergreen study, and that was their hybrid approach to adjust specific positions' salaries in total by 70,000. So it just depends on what position the person has and how it compares to their study as to who and what position will be getting an increase. But the cost of adding FICA and retirement to that $70,000 cost is $78,000 in total. And then one of the things that became clear is that this Evergreen study was really, and their recommendation just really impacts the existing positions. So it's the employees who are in existing positions. If we were to hire someone in for a vacancy that is more highly qualified or more years of experience than what the vacancy is currently has a budget for, we may need to increase the budget for that position enough to hire that person. Or there may be a promotion that may take place, which would put a person possibly in a higher range within the vacancy budget. So we need to have a little bit set aside to make adjustments like that in the next year, and we're setting aside 30,000, and then you add FICA and retirement, and that's the 33,000. So we may or may not need it depending on how the vacancies are filled.
Before you move on from that, so the big item there is this liability insurance doubling. Now, were we on like a fixed rate for a number of years and step up, or that seems extraordinary to have an insurance rate double.
I don't know the full explanation of that. I can find out more for you. I suspect it's because of the huge amount of damage, and also because we were grossly underinsured originally, and so we did not receive the insurance reimbursements that we should have based on our actual property values. So both of those.
So we're not just the same policy. We're actually getting more insurance for that.
Presumably, that,
Okay.
although the details aren't clear yet. But
Councilor Veach, what we'll do is as we get our premium, as they let us know what's going on, we will have lengthy discussions with them, because we obviously don't have a town hall to insure anymore. So I'm not sure why you would double your price when you don't have something to insure. So we're going to have to go through with them and really sit down and try to figure out exactly where we are and what they're saying. So it's that's what was talked about early on in May. And as we get further into it, there'll be deeper discussions about this. I've already talked to a couple of people that are in the know on this type of negotiation.
And I have heard from a lot of constituents that they're paying a lot of flood insurance for dirt lots.
okay, then we're also adjusting the budget for legal fees, and the reason why we're needing to do that is it was grossly under budgeted, and so we're bringing it up to what the fees will actually be. And if you compare the projected cost of the new town attorney to what we had been paying, it's actually going to be less. We're just seeing a budget increase because the original budget was so low. The increase in information technology services, it's 60,000, is to help upgrade and add new software and related expenses to help assist the town with its operations. We also have to adjust the accounting and auditing services budget to what the actual cost has been and is expected to be. This was under budgeted, so that's why you're seeing a large increase. We're adding training and tuition, or adding to the very small training and tuition reimbursement budget that existed. That's $22,300. And to go along with that, we're increasing an almost non-existent budget for travel per diem and meals budget by adding another $14,000 to it. And so this would facilitate the enablement of staff to attend necessary training to keep up with certifications and for any changes related to laws and regulations. There's a modest increase of supplies of about $16,000 that's related to inflation primarily. New janitorial services, this is a new line item. Those services were previously provided by 2 employees, one of whom was promoted, one of whom retired, and so it seemed more cost effective to contract out those services for the $10,000. And, excuse me, the rest of the difference is that negative $4,000. So there's hundreds of line items in the budgets that are, changing up or down depending on what it is. And so the net effect of all those other small changes is -4. So that accounts for the $2 million reduction from last year, or I'm sorry, for this year, FY23, to next year, FY24. This is just a glimpse of what it looks like by department, and I won't dwell on this, but just so you can see a summary of it, of how each department changed. You see a large reduction in the town manager's budget, but that's primarily the result of a shift of personnel from the town clerk's department. For example, the public information officer and the assistant there is moving out of the town clerk's office into the town manager's office. And we also had those couple of other positions that were added that were seen on the previous slide. And the town clerk's budget is dramatically down because of the removal of positions from that office. The public information officer is now under the town manager, and the IT person is now in the general department. Finance is relatively unchanged other than the increase in expenses of existing personnel and budget items there. Short-term rentals barely changed. The legal fees are going up, the $75,000 I mentioned. The budget for legal fees, not the actual expense. General government, we're seeing that large reduction because that's where so many of the items are. That's where the transfer into the capital fund was budgeted, that $4 million last year. So that's why we're seeing a net decrease of $3 million. But that general fund or general government budget actually increased apart from that elimination of that $4 million transfer as a result of moving in the IT expenses into the general government fund, and also adding the $240,000 contingency. Community development, it's mostly a reflection of the increase in the number of positions, the same with code enforcement. Town hall maintenance is really a slight increase. And public works administration is primarily the change in positions. Let's see. Public works maintenance is barely changed. Times Square, there's a very small budget change. We just left it the same because we really don't know what's happening there, so we left the budget the same for that. Maritime is a slight increase. Parking meter operations, slight increase. Warrenfield operations.
Joe, just for just for clarification, when we use the term community development, it's such a nebulous term, but that's where permitting falls under.
It is.
So when you see that increase in community development, it's an increase in staff to help with permitting.
Permitting, planning, and zoning, all of that,
Yeah,
yes.
just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, then Moorefield, there's additional technician added, additional expenses related there. Bayside Park, we just left the budget the same. Bay Oaks Recreation Center, that is a reflection of the change or the vacancies that are going to be carried forward until it's fully operational. The pool and Mound House changes, it's really a reflection of the rearrangement of personnel reorganization. Newton Park, we eliminated the budget mainly because there's nothing there right now. When we have something in the future, we can certainly do a budget adjustment to determine what exactly is needed going forward with Newton Park. And then beach monitoring and nourishment. It didn't have a budget last year, but it does for this year.
Could you explain to me the difference, why Maritime and Mooringfield are separated out, or maybe Andy can, or?
I knew this, but now my mind is blank at the moment. I'm sorry.
I think I asked the same question. I think it was like the mooring field is specific to the mooring field, but the town has other boats and trailers for other jobs, things like,
Correct, canal maintenance, things of that nature, things that are not mooring field related. So that's not a great explanation, but yeah, it's the canals basically and beach related stuff, that kind of thing that would not be actually done in the mooring field.
Thank you.
Thank you for that help there. Okay, so I went backwards, I'm sorry. Okay, let me just jump ahead. I don't know that you can see this. I can't even see it myself, so we tried at making a pie chart just to kind of give you an idea of what the expenses are, I'll have to look at my own copy of it. But this is how the expenses are divided up in the general fund. There's only 3% for contingency, wages 38%, benefits 13%, services 28%, commodities 4%, liability insurance 9%, and then the transfers out of the fund is 5%.
So when you have liability insurance, is that really all insurance? That's property insurance and?
Property insurance primarily, it's anything to do with liability, and then also workers' comp is included in that category.
So it's broader than just liability insurance.
It is,
Yeah.
at least for this purpose of presenting it. Okay, did I skip? Oh, I'm sorry, okay. This slide then, how are we going to fund the general fund increase? And so what I tried to do in my methodology or strategy for funding it is I first of all compared the revenue that we collected or are projecting to collect next year, and this is what I'm calling like pure revenue, and by that I mean it's not transfers in, it's not using an accumulation of savings in the fund balance, but these are brand new, these are the ongoing operational revenues that come in as a result of the town's operations. So pure revenue coming in for FY24 is only going to be $7.3 million compared to the $10.6 million that was budgeted for this year. So that $3.3 million loss is truly a loss of revenue, and that is what I believe the bridge loan that we were given by the state was based on lost revenue. That's what we had to provide them in our projections, and so it seems like a legitimate use then to use the bridge loan would be to cover that lost revenue. So that's why I have that arrow coming down. So we're starting with the pure revenue of $7.3 million. We're adding the use of the bridge loan of $3.3 million. And then, as was talked about in the millage rate discussion, we're pulling back $500,000 that had been transferred into the capital fund last year, or I should say this year. That was for the purpose of funding Estero Boulevard lighting, but now we have other funding sources for that, so we don't need to leave it in the capital fund for that purpose, so we're pulling it back. The $175,000, this is what we need to pay for the proposed leaving of the Benecon Consortium for health insurance. That $175,000, as I mentioned, is going to pay for any claims that exist that we need to continue paying on after we leave. But what we're using to pay for that is accumulation of refunds that we've received over the last 3 years from belonging to that Benecon Consortium or co-op. And each year we did receive our share as a member of that consortium of the surplus that they experienced by collecting more fees from us than they spent in claims expense and administration fees. So the accumulation of those refunds is enough, $175,000 to pay for what it will cost to leave Benecon. And then the difference is that $970,000 that we're proposing that we draw down from our ARPA funds, and we have roughly $3.5 million available, so this is almost $1 million of it here to be used. I could stop and just say that we do have until the end of 2024 to completely obligate whatever remaining ARPA funds we have, and by obligate, it's meant that we actually have a contractual obligation or a signed contract to spend that money. It's not just an intent or a plan, but it has to be a signed contract, or actually have spent it by the end of 2024. So that's why it's very important to really think about how we're going to use that money. I did not propose using it fully to cover the deficit that we're expecting for next year, so that we have as much of the ARPA funds available as an option. So I'm just trying to preserve our options for next year, and as we go further into next year, we can decide to use ARPA funds to pay instead of the bridge loan to cover that deficit, or we may decide to use the ARPA funds for something else, but at least we have that option.
So, Joe, I thought there were a lot of restrictions on the use of the ARPA funds.
There were originally, but as they clarified the, I think they call it the final ruling, the federal government for the use of monies that were deemed for the purpose of revenue replacement, they really broadened the allowable use of that, especially for those municipalities who received less than $10 million, which we did. We only received $3.5 million. So we are allowed to use it for any operational expense and for infrastructure expenses. So basically, it's almost anything the town would need to use it for, it can use it for at this point. Originally, it was just thought to be, it was restricted, and that's why it was originally restricted for the use of stormwater projects and water-type projects. But now it's open to anything operational or any other infrastructural need.
And where the loan money is just for revenue replacement, right? For operations.
Well, it's technically for operating expenses, I mean, which is going to be covered by it instead of the revenue that we would have collected.
But no capital projects for that.
Right, we're not allowed to use it for capital. Okay, and then this is just another graph of the sources of money. I apologize, you can't see it. We'll have to work on increasing the font size so it's legible. But this is just showing you the sources of funding coming into the general fund. Only 2% is grants, 20% is ad valorem taxes, 13% is other taxes. There's 11% are license, permit fees. Charges for services are 2%. Intergovernmental revenues, and this is like the share of the state's sales tax would be 2%. Fines and enforcements, fees is a small, only 5%. Transfers coming into the fund, 39%. And so most of that is the bridge loan and the ARPA funds. And then the use of our savings, that $175,000 is only 1%. And then another miscellaneous revenues of 5%. Okay. This is the budget for all funds, and I won't belabor this because I think we don't need to go into a lot of detail here, but so the top line is the general fund, and we just went through in more detail with that. It just outlines the few other funds that the town has. So we have the road impact fund. That's going down about $140,000 in terms of what the expected use will be. Parks, and what we try to do there is we try to fully budget the amount of impact fees we have, but it's not necessarily going to be used. But we just make that there to be allowed. The same with parks. We're trying to fully budget the amount that's there, but it doesn't necessarily mean it'll be used. The emergency fund, that is really where all the activity is passing through, but it is just so hard to even imagine next year. It's like, as I said, it'll be on a project by project basis as to where the funding is coming from. But when those projects are actually being paid for and expended, it'll be through that emergency fund. The gas tax fund, that has gone down significantly because of the revenue going down. Stormwater, that's up significantly because of the $10 million grant that we received for stormwater repairs. The beach access is down about $200,000, and that's related to the amount of grant dollars that we know we'll be receiving for next year. At this point, we could get more, but at this point, it's less than what was budgeted for last year. Building, that's where all the permit revenue is, and you see the large increase there, both because of the revenue and the additional personnel coming in. The debt service fund is relatively flat. The bridge loan, that's just showing that we're using $3 million of the almost, I think it's 11.9 million that we have. The capital fund, it's showing that we're using almost $0.2 million, but 500 of it is coming back into the general fund. That's what 500 of it is. And the other, the remainder of it is just an estimated use of how we're going to spend. It's like 25% of the remaining budget for repairs and replacements. Community enhancements projects, we're budgeting the use of the remaining balance of the loan that's available, but we have a very short window of opportunity to use it, but we have it fully reflected in the budget. The water here, I think the reduction there, I just looked this up before I came here, and I'm trying to remember why that is down. Well, obviously the usage is down. We'll have to get back to you on what the other explanation is for that. And then the American Rescue Plan, I'm showing that we're using the entire amount of the balance. Okay, and then this is where all the money goes for all of the funds. I won't, but that's where the percentage-wise, the same presentation. And then this is where the money's coming from for the rest of the funds. So I'm sorry if I took too long at any one point, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Questions for Joe? Joe, I just think it was a great overview. I appreciate the transparency that you're providing. I think it just, since the public's watching today, I just think one of the things that we're all wrestling with strategically, you're using that bridge loan to help us with that shortfall, which we hope is temporary, obviously, as we recover. And we have these ARPA funds available as well, which don't have to be repaid. Bridge loan theoretically has to be repaid. Well, it does have to be repaid unless there is a chance, and that's the bizarre world in which we all live in right now, that the legislature, and they have a history of this, you've been doing a deep dive on this. I mean, are you hopeful for the future? Are you concerned? Where just give us a sense of where you are philosophically and what keeps you awake at night.
Well, I'm both concerned and hopeful. If that is, maybe that's a political answer. I am very concerned because when you just look at it, the black and white picture of what we know for sure, we know our revenues are going to be down. We signed an agreement. We need to repay back the bridge loan. So, I mean, those are hard facts. But we are told it may be forgiven, and so I am hopeful of that. But yet also when you read the language of the agreement, we're expected to pay back the bridge loan based on our ability to pay. And so although I'm concerned about having to repay it, I also at the same time realize we do not need to repay it until we are able to repay it. And so even if they held us to repaying the loan, it won't be until we are able to repay it. But I am hopeful that it'll be forgiven, or there'll be other funding coming in from other sources, state appropriations, or other sources that would replace the bridge loan if we do have to repay it. So I do have hope in that respect. And one of my concerns at the moment is just all the uncertainty surrounding all the other projects that are underway or about to start or being contemplated. How are we going to rebuild our own infrastructure? And there are many opportunities for funding, but there's nothing firmly established. We have much hope for FEMA. You know, we're in the process of applying for the reimbursements there. We've been advanced reimbursements. So all of that is in place, but as far as the timing of it goes, we may not necessarily be reimbursed at the point we need to be because we're paying these funds out first and then we're being reimbursed afterwards. So that's a concern, which is why I'm trying to hold on to the ARPA funds, at least for the next few months, and not fully commit them until we know for sure that we can get through the next year without needing to use them for any other purpose, and then other than, you know, using it instead of the bridge loan. And I think it's just too soon, for at least for me, to know that, to be confident in recommending, yes, let's go ahead and use those ARPA funds, because I'm not confident that we're not going to need them for any of these other projects that we're trying to get off the ground.
Very good. I appreciate that analysis, Joe. Yeah. Go
If I
ahead,
may.
Mr. Town Manager.
One thing about the bridge loan, just for me, it might be one other person out there that thinks like I do and maybe is wondering this. If we don't spend the bridge loan, it's probably not going to get forgiven. You probably have to spend the money to get it forgiven, correct? Unless it's turned into a grant. So I think there's a couple of things and also the budget's reduced by 6% if you didn't give that number up there. So Joe's done a very good job conservatively budgeting for the town with all that looks like is added, we've actually reduced. And it's by necessity, so great job, Joe. But I wasn't here when the bridge loan was applied for and gotten and all that, so I don't know all those details. So it could have been something that was explained way back, so I apologize if I'm asking the obvious question.
Well, I'm not sure if I can answer it in the way that you're asking the question, only because from my perspective, my understanding of it is that the requirement to repay it is based on our ability to repay it. So whether or not we've actually used it, I guess I'd have to think about that. But to me, the whole thing hinges on, are we able to repay it? And, just looking at a revenue loss of $3.3 million alone, I don't know how we could. We could repay the portion that's not used, certainly. That's no problem. It's just how are we going to repay the other portion? That's what I'm concerned about.
I think to your point, Mr. Town Manager, it's a great question, but I don't, if I'm the state of Florida, I'm not going to forgive a loan that we didn't utilize. So I think your point's well taken, and I think this analysis, Joe, is helpful because these are the policy issues we're wrestling with in a world that's not terribly predictable, which is challenging, but potentially hopeful.
Yes, I agree. That's what made this budgeting so difficult.
Any other questions for Joe?
It's not so much a question, but just a statement that I so appreciate the thoroughness of this budget process this year, the total transparency of this budget process. Years past, we didn't have a formal CFO position. We do now. And Joe, you have just taken it to the nth degree in explanation and making sure that people are understanding. I know we all had individual meetings, great conversation during those meetings. Why this, why that? I had a lot of questions because this is my first official budget process meeting with the town. But I just want to compliment you on the transparency and the thoroughness that you've given us. Really appreciated.
Thank you. That was my
I'm actually
goal.
looking forward to meetings in September on the budget.
And I'll just say that, it seemed like it was a very detailed thing, but Joe managed to distill this down to a handful of slides, and I think we all appreciate that.
I can go on for the whole day if you'd like.
This is our homework going into our September meetings. So
Well said. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate your hard work.
Item C, fiscal year 23-24 health insurance renewal. Mr. Town Manager, I know we're going to have a subject matter expert here, but do you want to set the table and introduce our speakers?
I actually do. I really want to introduce a couple of people, but this is Talisa Oliveira. She's our human resources manager. There's a lot of interesting connections between Talisa and I, and I'll just take a moment. We both grew up in the same town. We both went to high school. We didn't go to high school together, but rival high schools. And she was actually born on my wife and I's anniversary, which is tomorrow. So, and 33 years ago tomorrow. So there's just some things. I'm a numbers guy, so right in the universe. So yeah, that's a little odd. So we just found that part out yesterday in talking. But anyhow, Talisa's
And
been
I
doing
did
it.
not know this until after Annie joined the team.
Right.
So it's just small world coincidence.
Yeah, it's
I don't hear the same accent, though.
it's a little bit. I hear it. If we're talking just by ourselves,
Yeah.
it's really there.
I have been here for 12 years, so I've lost a little bit of my southern twang. But if I have like an I, it's typically a longer I. But I've moved away from that a bit.
Talisa, I'm going
Talisa,
to
pull
ask you to
the-
pull that mic down.
Sure, yes,
And
I
since
am
it's-
short.
Since it's the first time at the mic, you might just give a little background on
It-
where you came from.
If I may,
Or,
real quick,
Mr. Mayor, go
Shelby
ahead.
Armand, I want to introduce her. Shelby has stepped up in the middle of the post-disaster and really just filled a need that the town had in human resources. It was contracted out, I believe, or just not a lot of continuity. So as you see how we've taken positions that were previously contracted out and maybe wasn't fully transparent and maybe even didn't follow everything like I think it should be followed. I'll leave it at that. But again, this waives, nobody knows you, but I'll turn it over to Lisa. They've done a great job.
Yes, thank you so much, Shelby. Shelby has been a huge help, and I'm so grateful to have had her within my transition to the beach. Okay, so I am Talisa Oliveira. I'm the HR manager of the town of Fort Myers Beach. I joined in the end of April. I come from private sector consulting. I was a human resources consultant for 5 years in private sector. I am a SHRM certified, CP certified HR professional, and I'm working on getting my FPHR certification as well. So this is my first journey in the public sector. I found myself here because I have a servant's heart, and I was called to it. So I'm very grateful to be involved and appreciate each one of you for giving me the opportunity. Okay. I am a bit nervous, so bear with me. Okay, so keep in mind I am an HR gal through and through, but I'm not an insurance broker, so I'll try to answer your questions the best of my ability. I understand the plans, but we all know insurance, and it can get a little convoluted, so if I can't answer any of your questions, I have Shelby going to take notes, and we have some brokers who could potentially come back and present for you. So we are under renewal. We are renewing October 1st. And, you know, what I've noticed is obviously the Fort Myers Beach has been through a transformation these past 10 months that has been, you know, very difficult for the town. And our needs prior to the hurricane may not be the needs that we have currently. My recommendation is to answer your question that you mentioned earlier, Jim. Benecon is the consortium that we are currently a part of. So we're a part of their pool, and we have direct coverage under United Healthcare. My recommendation is going to, and that's a self-insured model. My recommendation is going to be that we move to FMIT. We will have the exact same plan design, the exact same carrier, United Healthcare, but we would go through a fully insured model, which I will talk with you about as we go through the presentation. And then my recommendation is that we renew with our supplemental coverages as well. So part of my process.
At least you glossed over the fact that it would also save the town roughly $27,000 a year. I know there's an exit penalty of $175,000, but that's offset by the refund by the pool.
Right.
So,
Yes.
So really, it's an overall savings for the town of $27,000.
Exactly, and I want to get in more to that. When so we went out to market, we asked for RFPs, and we had some very interesting proposals that came back. The most competitive offer would save us $26,000. So I'll go more in depth with you when I get to that slide. But thank you for that. Okay, so I did my due diligence process. Obviously, coming in, there weren't a lot of tangible items as far as contracts. We didn't have access to our carriers. There wasn't a lot of visibility, so I didn't know the last time that they had done a thorough process of our current plan, what it offers, how rich it is. So I did assess the current policy. I consulted with the insurance experts in the public sector realm. I evaluated our options in the market, and I have a recommended course of action. So through my assessment, there were positives and negatives. I'm going to start with the negatives. We had I think our highest claim year that I had seen in recent years. We are tracking 150% over expected costs, and that has resulted in a very high increase in cost through our proposal process. The positives were I did an employee outreach. I had 100% of employees that stated that they really enjoyed the plan. Our deductibles are extremely low. Our co-pays are low. We pay 100% of the employee-only premiums. We pay 50% of the dependent premiums. So for retainment and recruitment, this was like a blessing for me to hear because we do have a great health plan and we are competitive. We're so competitive that in our current consortium, our plan actually it weighs, or it's richer than 85% of the participants in the consortium. So based on that analysis, my goal was to, I don't want to cause any more change right now. I want to keep and maintain what we have. And if I can find a way to make that more cost effective for the town during this crucial time, that was my ultimate goal. So I was really grateful to have the Gearing Group help me out. They actually went out to market with us and went out with RFP to market. And the next slide will show us. So these are the these are the members who actually reached out and responded to our RFP. So United Healthcare Direct, they responded. Cigna responded. Then we have FMIT who responded. That's going through the United Healthcare Network. And then we have Benecon Consortium. That's our current provider through the United Healthcare Network, who also provided their renewal. The next slide. Thank you. Okay. So FMIT, Benecon, and Cigna came back, and they actually offered to maintain our current level of benefits. So that very rich plan, they would maintain that exactly the same. So the renewal with Benecon, they are the self-funded model. They actually came back with a 13.8% increase, which would include a $121,000 increase in annual costs. United Healthcare Direct came back on a fully insured model with about 11% increase or $96,000 in annual costs. Cigna Direct came back on a self-funded model with a 14.5% increase or $108,000 in annual cost of increase. And then our most competitive is FMIT on the United Healthcare Network. They came back fully insured, but there was actually a 2.9% reduction in cost, representing a cost savings of $26,000 annually. And obviously, this is the most competitive offer. If you go to the next slide, Jacob, perfect. So this is our side-by-side comparison. So the second column, that's our current plan. On the bottom, you can see the monthly premium costs for employee, and then it breaks it down by their coverage levels. The second is the renewal. So that's where you see that 13.7% increase, which is a large number. And even on those monthly premium costs, it's, the town we would need to absorb that, and that's a lot to absorb. So if you go to the last column, that's Cigna. So Cigna came in with a rate pass, with not a rate pass, with a plan design. They're maintaining the plan design. However, making that change in the carrier, I recommend against it. If they're going to increase this 14.5 and we have to change the network, I don't recommend that. I think that's too much on the employees right now and administratively. So that would rule them out for me. And then the alternate two, United Healthcare, anywhere that you see red, that's actually a decrease in benefits. So they've increased our cost to the employees on the plan. So we don't want to, increase costs and decrease the benefits. So to me, that also ruled them out. So that leaves our two finalists would be Benecon on a self-insured plan, which is our current provider, and FMIT, who came in considerably lower on a fully insured model with the same carrier. Next slide, please. Thank you. So that gives you a closer breakdown of the two finalists, our executive summary here. And, again, we have a very, very competitive offer from FMIT that I really think we need to look at. Let me get back into my notes here. Okay. So if we do go to FMIT, that does bring us to our next point, which Joe did mention, is there are run-out costs associated with leaving a self-funded consortium. My concern is we've had a very high claim year, and there's an unpredictability behind that. So if we don't get out from underneath that, we could potentially have a higher increase next year that we may not be able to absorb. And then we also have these daunting termination fees. $175,000. We actually have the money in the budget. It was set aside because of the surplus, thankfully, for this exact situation. If we get out of the consortium and we go to fully insured, we completely mitigate that risk for the town. I feel like we really need to stabilize now. We can always look at our options later on, but I feel like that is going to be the best move because we all know that health insurance is not going to stop increasing anytime soon, and those termination costs will go up as well. The fees go up. There's not a lot of transparency that's offered within that consortium because the money is, to me, it's constantly moved around. So it's really hard to manage. It's really hard administratively. It's hard to keep up with. And again, with our claim unpredictability for next year, my recommendation is that we can get out of it while we can. We can go to the next slide.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
You said we've had a unreasonably high claim year.
Mm-hmm.
Are there claim codes that show trending on what those claims were?
Sure. So they are related to chronic illness.
Okay.
On that same issue, has our broker, or do we have a risk manager that's taken a look, or maybe Jason would know as Public Works Director? I mean, clearly post-Ian, I'm guessing our staff is doing different things that are potentially more dangerous and more potentially stressful, or at least are exposing additional risk to the town.
Sure.
I assume that's a factor as well that could.
Absolutely. And, you know, we don't have any supporting documentation or any, you know, factual documentation to support that. I will say the claims have definitely increased since following the hurricane, and you're seeing more, any claims incurred, yeah, thank you. Any claims incurred from the beginning of our plan year to 9/30/2023, but that are billed after the fact, which is common. I mean, what you would see is you would see this trending really high the first 2 or 3 months while UHC is working on closing everything out, but we could have those trickle. So we really do need, if we're going to leave the, you know, the insurance to get past that year. And again, because we're in a position to do so and really stabilize our group, I think it's important that we do. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I actually got a lot of great feedback from the group, too, on our supplemental insurances. We also trend upwards among our competitors as far as what our deductibles are, what our annual maximums are for our supplementals, a lot of things that you don't see anymore. So, you know, I was very, very, you know, huge proponent of let's keep our benefits and maintain them for the group. Our dental insurance through Lincoln came back with an initial 5% increase, which Gearing Group was able to negotiate down to 0%. So we're maintaining all of our benefits with no change. Our brokers, our carriers, I think a lot of them really worked with us due to our current situation, and I'm really grateful for that. So that's really great news. And again, just to summarize, my recommendation is that we do move to a FMIT through the fully insured plan and take that cost savings annual cost of $26,000 and get out of the current Benecon consortium that we're in. And then my recommendation is also that we renew all of our existing supplemental coverages to maintain consistency. And that will open it up to questions for you.
I have kind of a question, just I know you say you're not an insurance person particularly, but okay, self-insurance versus fully insured. Now, when you're self-insured, is there like the consortium has a pool and they actually pay out of that pool, but fully insured means there's like a reinsurance agent or something, or
Sure.
what's the difference?
So that's a good question. Sorry, my mouth is so dry. Okay, so self-insurance, basically, it comes with a risk, but there's also a pro to it. So if you track a really good year and everyone else in the consortium tracks a really good year, you have the opportunity of getting a surplus. So you get billed monthly for your maximum cost. If you track lower than that over that 12-month period, they reconcile everything in like February, March every year. And then if you were tracking great and we had lower claims, I might not be recommending this, but it's unpredictable and I have a concern with it. FMIT has 96 members. They have 63 members on medical. The other are on dental or vision. So we have more leverage there. And we have, you know, a larger pool of members to make it less of a volatile pool and a less risky pool to be involved in at this time.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You drank out of it.
We're
He
really
has
not
my
that
back.
scary.
No, you're not. No, you're not. I'm just nervous.
No, I like the fact that we are not changing providers. We're not changing, you know, doctors or, you know,
Co-pays,
any of that type
deductibles.
of thing, so that employees don't have to go through and find all new
Yeah.
doctors and dentists and everything else.
It's not the
United
right time for
Healthcare,
that.
I'm a little bit biased. That was my alma mater my last 10 years. They are everywhere,
Mhm.
and they pay claims very effectively.
Mhm.
So to stay with them as well, because they practically own Florida
Mm-hmm.
for any kind of benefits. So
Yes, I completely agree with that. That was my major driving factor. And like I said, I was so happy to find that our plan is so rich and I did not want to change that. I don't think it's the right time. Also, with going with the Gearing Group, we're going to have so much more customer service support, resources, education. Our open enrollment this year will be completely different than it ever has been. We have paper enrollment forms that are being sent to a broker to process. I'm going to automate everything with their help, and we'll have them come out. We'll have our AFLAC brokers come out. We'll have our 401A brokers come out to educate the team on what they have, their current portfolios. I want the employees to be able to utilize this rich plan to the best of their abilities and be proactive about the wellness of our team and our plan.
So full disclosure, this all started before I got here. Keith had kind of initiated the change and going through and looking at it. But during the collapse, we kept having, when I was in Surfside, this group show up, and they were bringing mental health professionals and things like that. And I've just so much going on. I finally asked my HR director, what's going on, and she told me, and I forgot. But then we were talking and reviewing what we were going to do here. Come to find out, it was that group, and we weren't even contracted with them. They came to us because they wanted to volunteer, because they wanted to help.
Yeah.
So that's a big deal when you see people that more about your physical health, but also the mental health. And in this day and age, and with what has happened here, it's a big deal. The other thing that I've done everywhere I've been, just for informational purposes, I asked Talisa to look into elected officials being included in our health insurance, and it is allowable. It also happens everywhere, so that's something you have to decide. We just want to provide that information if that ever comes up. I've not gotten any discussions with you guys about that, but anyhow, just as we're talking about health insurance, we like to be as transparent as possible and put everything out there, but that is something that if it was ever decided by this body or another body or future years, that is also an availability because of your status as a kind of employee, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. So I did reach out to Gearing Group last night, and she reached out to one of her partners. They said that, and I actually sent it out to my internal network and asked if their council members were covered. Most responded yes. So I do think it's common practice. They receive the same or similar benefits that the employees receive. So I reached out to the Gearing Group, and they said we could absolutely add the council members if that's what you all wanted to do to the plan, and you would receive, again, the same or similar coverages.
Not bad for kind of employees.
Elected officials.
Can I, just a couple quick questions. First of all, I thought your analysis was excellent, and I support making the change.
Thank you.
In this new program, do they have a health savings account as part of their plan, and how would that work?
Sure. So we could absolutely utilize a health savings account. Basically, how that works is employees would have to set up, or we could partner with a bank. Any bank that offers an HSA. My recommendation would be we find one that do not charge our employees annual fees. We partner with one, and employees can just set that up through payroll deduction. And maybe one day down the line we look at contributing dollar for dollar to an HSA, because it's a great tax saving advantage for employees. But yeah, we could set that up, and United Healthcare would absolutely support that. So it would be just a payroll deduction that would go into their health savings account. It's always their money, it never lapses, and they can use it on qualifying health expenses.
I would encourage you to explore that. Not only are there tax benefits, but there's other benefits in an HSA that could be helpful in terms of controlling costs, et cetera. I just would yield to the town attorney. I'll just speak for myself personally. I'm very blessed. My wife works for a health insurance company, and we've got great health insurance, so I wouldn't need it. But I'm not opposed to allowing my colleagues participate if they need, and they would need to pay in, if just as any town employee would have to pay in. What would we need to do procedurally, Madam Town Attorney, to make that possible?
Okay, I did look at, is this on?
You have to get closer.
Okay. I did look at the charter, and I believe that it is absolutely permissible for you to participate. And if you wanted to do that, then I would suggest that we adopt a resolution that would provide for that, and then the paperwork could be given out, and the people who wanted it could do it.
Is there consent amongst my colleagues to have the town attorney draft that up?
Personally, I don't need it, but I'm totally open to having anyone else who does, so, yes.
Counselor Veach?
I've been interested in knowing what the economic impacts are, looking at the numbers, because, you know, it might double our compensation effectively. If this is, you know, well, some of the premium amounts, if you get all these packages, I think that, you know, considering our low compensation as counselors, so it's a significant decision.
Sure, I could absolutely look into that and get those numbers for you. I get what you're saying.
But are you comfortable at least drafting a resolution so we can have that discussion?
I'm comfortable with going on to a discussion, yes.
Counselor King?
Most certainly.
So Town Attorney, I think you've got some direction there.
Yes,
And then we can
I'll
have
do that.
obviously, it'll be fully transparent, and we'll have that
Absolutely.
conversation at the appropriate time. Any other questions for our Human Resources Director? Is that your formal title?
I'm Human Resources Manager currently.
Very good.
Just fantastic job on this, and great job on your presentation as well.
Thank you all so much. I'm really excited to support you all.
Great.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for being here this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think this is a quick one before the next one, I think. So maybe we could just get this one in before we have a break. Is everybody okay with that? Madam Town Attorney or Mr. Town Manager, I believe we discussed this a little bit on Monday. What's the extent of the need for conversation on item D at this point?
I think at this point, just a direction probably given to the town attorney to either draft some sort of, I don't know if it needs to be a resolution or an ordinance, or how she would recommend proceeding.
I believe we on Monday, correct me if I'm wrong, colleagues, I believe we yielded to the town attorney to draft up a policy that would give the mayor the ability to have discretion with proper notice in advance for folks who wanted to do this on a case-by-case basis. I think that's what we said on Monday.
Okay, and I would like to find out, I think it's not only the public, but it's when y'all are unable to attend?
I believe we have, at least through practice, maybe not through policy, we have allowed members to call in when they have an excused absence or they're going to be out of town for whatever reason, and there's consent amongst the body. So I
Okay.
think that we have a policy that allows that already. Somebody correct me if
Okay.
I'm wrong.
Madam Attorney, also, in previous experience, especially post-COVID, I know that there was a big push for a lot of towns to, as long as they had the equipment and the ability to hold Zoom-related meetings, it could be done where you could vote. If you had COVID or something, you could be away and vote. I think that's a big deal as well. Just having conversations is one thing, but then going that step, so that's something that you would probably want to address as well.
Yeah, I think
And-
we adopted that during COVID. I think we had that policy for the town, and I guess my one question procedurally or from a parliamentary standpoint, Madam Town Attorney, I think, is there a proviso that if you're calling in and your vote is a deciding vote that you wouldn't be able to vote? Is that?
No.
Okay.
No, that is not.
So we can allow folks to vote via phone then?
Absolutely. Now, when a council member is not going to be here, they should make arrangements to call in. And before they can start participating in the meeting, you all would need to take a vote to allow that. And it's a very simple thing. Other councils and commissions do that all the time.
I think that's actually an appropriate safeguard. I clearly know, since I've been on the council, nobody's ever abused this, but that certainly could be a problem in the future, and having that fail-safe measure would probably be helpful.
And I have experienced a council member in another city where she just didn't want to come to the meeting. She was sitting at her house, a few blocks away. And it got to the point where they said no. But, it's supposed to be for extraordinary purposes. Either you're out of town, you can't get there, or you're ill and you don't want to spread your germs around, or whatever.
I think that's a great safeguard. Does everybody consent to that additional safeguard?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I think we learned from COVID is when you do invite the public to call in, the public comment gets quite a bit longer.
Well, and if you remember correctly, Counselor Veach, we also had some technology challenges with that as well that made it frustrating as well. So I fortunately, we have a council that is almost always here, healthy or not. And I think this is a good step forward.
Would we be including, and maybe I have this mixed up, but I thought it would be, they'd be calling in, they could participate like that, but if it was on a particular subject, like if they had to testify for something or part of an agenda item, not necessarily just for public comment.
Now, we're talking about two different things. Are you talking about the counselors, or are you talking about the public comment?
Public comment.
Okay, I think we almost have a two-track system, I think, one for the council,
It would be separate.
separate issue.
Okay.
But I'm sorry,
Right.
Counselor Woodson, your point, you're referring to the public.
Right.
I think you raised an issue that I don't know that we've addressed today, and I think it's an important one, is if people submit a public comment and they want it read or they want to read it over the phone, I think that's a different issue that probably is worth discussing, because I know somebody sent in some comments that were not read, and then sometimes they were read, sometimes they weren't read. I think we probably need to establish a policy on that. My personal preference is, just given, it's not necessarily our time, we're veterans at having marathon meetings. I get concerned when the audience is full, and when there's attorneys that people are paying for variances to be with them and sitting there. I think that that public comment ought to certainly go to all the, I'm sorry, if somebody submits something in writing, I think it ought to be part of the record. I think each council person ought to be disseminated those comments so we have a chance to read them. But if you're not physically here to have folks in the audience, a full house particularly, have to go through multiple readings of these, the comments, I just, it's really more out of respect for the folks who come to the meetings time, but I'd be curious to hear my colleagues' view on that, because I struggle with that one.
I agree too, because you've got, and I appreciate that people are spread out now, that they can't be here and they want to have a comment. But I think that at least speaking for myself, I read the emails. You know, when someone sends something, I do read it.
And they come through on our council emails so that they are part of
The record?
the record and can be submitted as part of the record, but they don't have to be read again at the meeting.
You comfortable with that, Councilor King?
Total agreement.
I think one of our constituents who I've heard from, and understandably so, I think there was some confusion because sometimes comments were read at meetings, sometimes they weren't. I think as long as we have an established policy that's consistent for everybody, I think that would assuage some of her concerns.
Now, and so another kind of a third tier of this is that if we have a quasi judicial item, is someone allowed to testify remotely?
I think that's where, Counselor Veach, I think that's what we discussed on Monday, where that person would have to, in advance, ask permission through the town, and then we would give discretion to the mayor to make that decision as to whether the circumstances warrant that. I think.
Right, but I'm also just curious to the attorney, because I'm sure there may be some limit to where you're allowed remote participation.
You mean legally,
Okay.
yeah.
In quasi-judicial hearings, my strong suggestion is that if you allow one side, the applicant, for instance, to attend by phone, you should allow comments by phone, or not allow either one.
I think that's excellent, right? Yeah. And I think we'll leave that discretion to the mayor, but I think the folks need to have a decent reason, because it is challenging to navigate that. Anything else on that issue? And I guess, Becky, we'll just incorporate this into our policies and procedures then, as you,
I will find out, do you adopt the policies and procedures by resolution? Most people do. I'll just draft a resolution and then it can be put among those. Okay.
do folks want to take a brief recess before we get to resilient lead? You want to, okay, I hear affirmative, we'll take a 5-minute recess. Yeah, I never did make it to the restroom. Item D on the agenda, if we're good to go, Jacob, I'm going to yield to the town manager for,
E.
What?
E. We just did B.
I'm sorry, item E, Resilient Lee Recovery Task Force. An open discussion of the Resilient Lee Recovery Task Force. I'm going to start with the town manager, and then you can yield as where you feel appropriate.
Thank you,
Mr. Town
Vice
Manager?
Mayor.
Yeah.
Thank you, Council. We have a couple of people here today, one you know, Ann Compson with Tidal Basin. Also, we have Ashley Edwards with Tidal Basin. This document that's before you is kind of like our response and our public speaking for next Tuesday, I believe, is with the Resilient Lee Committee, CDBG DR group that's coming in.
Not just Tidal Basin alone, but, you know, the whole recovery organization. A big one is the Safe Turtle Lighting, an application for $7.9 million went up under the Florida Legislative Appropriations Program. And we had a follow-up meeting with Director Guthrie, where he gave all assurances that funding that initiative was a priority. So I think right now that Andy and the gang are working out the cost of that program with Florida Power and Light. So that is a priority it is moving.
And I got a little confused by what you said. Is that are you saying that it will not be under Resilient Lee? It'll be coming from the state and the legislative appropriation? Or are you saying it'll be under Resilient Lee?
It will not be, well, the Resilient Lee is kind of a overall planning function, but that would not be something we would put towards CDBG-DR. That's going to be something that's funded by the state under the Legislative Appropriations Program.
Okay.
And that program is $350 million that the legislature provided to FDEM to administer. And, you know, we've submitted about 21 applications in total. FDEM indicated that their preference for providing funding was in the form of advances or loans against projects that would eventually be paid for by FEMA public assistance.
And there was the 350, but then I think there was a subset of that.
There was.
That Representative Botana was successful in achieving for his district, which we're part of, correct?
Yes, correct.
And that's a separate.
That's
It's
within the 350.
part of the 350. So
yes.
we've been reserved a subset of the 350
Yes.
based upon Representative Botana's work. Is that fair?
Yes, that is fair. And you know, through the outreach from the town management organization, the mayor, to Guthrie, I think that the town's needs appear very much on the radar with FDEM, and I think that's going to yield some results. You know, during that same conversation a couple of weeks ago, you know, the way town hall kind of languished for a while, you know, we got that jump started, and you know, from the time Guthrie said yes, we'll do it, to it now being almost gone has only been about 2 weeks. And from my experience, that process can usually last anywhere from 6 months to a year. So there are things that are moving along. And, you know, there are a couple of other priorities that were identified through the Resilient Lee planning process, the canal clearance, the dredging, whatnot. It is a complex issue. It's a jurisdictional hot potato, you know, whether the county is saying it's not us, the state's saying we have limited jurisdiction. You know, the Corps of Engineers has weighed in and offered assistance, but they want to do a study and then they want to do a plan, and, you know, 5 years down the road, maybe the canals, you know, will get cleared. So it's just kind of things that we're working through. We do maintain, as part of our support of the overall town recovery strategy, we maintain a unfunded or underfunded needs project list. We're scrubbing that list right now. We're getting input from folks like Chad, who have really developed a lot of interesting projects on the environmental project side. We're trying to fill in where we are seeking funding and how things, where we still have funding gaps. But in terms of those unmet needs, the biggest thing that we've been looking for and waiting for is the Lee County draft action plan for the $1.1 billion under CDBG DR. And that action plan was published for public comment at the end of July. Public comment will be open through the end of August. And what you have in front of you is the draft version of the town of Fort Myers Beach comments on that plan. I'm going to turn the mic over to Ashley Edwards, our CDBG DR subject matter expert and the author of the comments, to explain more about that, the comment process and the draft, how the draft action plan works.
Ashley, first of all, welcome. Before you get granular,
Yes.
if you could take it up 10,000 feet for folks who are watching and explain why you're here, what this is, just in a nutshell, and then go deep.
Yes, sir, absolutely. And I certainly appreciate that this is not the most recreational reading you've probably had come across your desk. This is very technical. It's very specific. Let me back up just a step and say, of course, my name is Ashley Edwards, consultant here supporting Tidal Basin. 18 years ago, I went to work for Governor Haley Barbour in the state of Mississippi immediately after Katrina's landfall in Mississippi. And, of course, you all remember the devastation it did there. Community Development Block Grant Program was used to send unmet needs funding to states for the first time as a result of Hurricane Katrina. And so, in many ways, we sort of paved the path to using these types of funds to come into a disaster-stricken area and meet these unmet needs. And of course, we've worked with a number of different disasters over the year, all of which have flowed through the CDBG-DR program. These funds are very specific to disaster areas, okay? Community Development Block Grant is a normal program, an annual program that happens each year. Lee County is involved in that, as are counties, cities, states across the United States. But the CDBG-DR program is very specific. It's made available by direct congressional appropriation. CDBG is the vehicle by which these funds flow. But the intent of these funds is not to essentially duplicate the normal CDBG program every year. It's really to provide resources directly to meet the unmet needs in the hardest hit areas. And so as a result of that,
Ashley, I'm going to stop you just real quick, just to again provide some overview. These funds,
Yes.
they come from HUD, Housing Urban Development, correct?
Correct. So they originate in congressional appropriations, they flow down to HUD, and then out to subrecipients.
I think that's where some of the confusion lies, because
Yes.
when it comes from HUD, you assume it has to do with housing.
Right.
I know a lot of it does, but some of it doesn't, right?
That's correct, yes. In fact, the decision was made back in the fall of 2005 by Congress that was creating a giant supplemental appropriation for Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and even Florida as a result of Hurricane Katrina, to try to find an existing avenue within federal program statute to send these funds. And of course, it was sort of like fitting a square peg in a round hole. There just weren't programs outside of the Stafford Act or outside of FEMA to come in and do things that FEMA wasn't designed to do. And I often sort of use it very simply by saying, FEMA comes in to determine what was damaged and how to repair that direct damage. CDBG funds begin where the FEMA funds end and look at all of the additional things that you're going to do to help spur recovery. That can include everything from housing to infrastructure, very importantly, economic revitalization, which is a way that these funds are often deployed. And so Certainly in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina, it was the first time they've been used. It had been used. Over the last 18 years, this has been used in many, many states, and so there's great precedent now for how they're used. And $1.1 billion was given in a direct allocation to Lee County. And generally speaking, what you find is that the state is actually the subrecipient or the subgrantee from the federal government. So the state writes the action plan, and then communities make applications back to the state. In this specific case, because HUD has made a direct allocation to Lee County, they essentially are serving in the role of the state. And so they have to create an action plan that they send back to HUD. It's a very, very important part of the process in which they tell HUD directly how they intend to spend these funds. Now, I don't mean on granular projects. They're not identifying, we're going to put so much into this project or so much into this project. They're essentially creating programs, housing programs, infrastructure programs. And in that, they're talking about specifically what will be eligible for those funds. So what we did here is we took the action plan that was released on August 1st, and we did a comprehensive analysis of their draft action plan that will go back to HUD saying this is how we intend to deploy this $1.1 billion in our community. Immediately when we started digging into it, we were looking at it with, standing in the shoes of the town of Fort Myers Beach. How will these things ultimately benefit Fort Myers Beach, or how will they hinder Fort Myers Beach's ability to tap into these funds and use them in the community? And so what you have here really is, there are two primary things. One is a very thorough analysis of every bit of that action plan, looking at exactly what they're proposing to do and identifying the concerns that Fort Myers Beach should have as a result of what they propose. As it is currently written, I don't think it is a stretch to say it will be difficult for Fort Myers Beach to tap into the vast majority of the funding streams. Generally speaking, what they're doing is aiming a lot of the money at housing, which is a very, very worthy goal. But the program is not designed solely for housing. It's designed for comprehensive unmet needs to bring about a comprehensive local recovery strategy. And that can include all of the elements that have to tie together to have a thriving community. Affordable housing, quality infrastructure, small business assistance, economic revitalization, buyouts of properties, acquisitions of properties for new development. Really, the CDBG DR program is far and away the most flexible program under that CDBG umbrella. And it's designed that way with waivers, for example, that can be requested, built into statute, that allow the communities that are impacted to go back to the federal government and say, we need all of these considerations to ensure that these funds ultimately will flow down to us and that they will be eligible to be used on the types of projects and priorities we locally have and need to bring about. Our concern in reading the document, the draft action plan document Lee County released, is that it was not taking advantage of all of those avenues, whether it's specific waiver requests, including things like specific HUD national objectives that are eligible but were not included in the action plan. And so, what we believe that we've provided here is really a roadmap to give Fort Myers Beach every conceivable bit of flexibility, every conceivable bit of priority that they can possibly have to receive funds. And then along with that analysis and sort of critical, look at exactly what they've proposed to do, we've listed a number of specific requests that we're recommending to you all to make of them at the end of the document. And those requests are on things like waivers that you should be asking for with HUD. In fact, I was talking to the mayor and Andy just yesterday morning, and they were relaying to me that when the Deputy Secretary of HUD was here, there were discussions about, we expect you to ask for some of these waivers so you can deploy these funds locally to do these things. Those waivers were not included in Lee County's draft action plan.
So those waivers, just to kind of,
Yes.
so like I know with the program it says 70% of the money is supposed to go to benefit LMI individuals.
Correct.
And there's a certain percentage that's supposed to go to most affected areas.
That's correct.
But they define the entire county as the most affected area.
They do, in fact, yes. HUD clearly expects that those things will be coming. They expect them. That you find it time and time again where states ask for these types of considerations back from HUD. And they certainly have a greater willingness to grant them, especially when they understand that it's helping to facilitate the flow of resources down to the ground zero, the hardest hit areas of these disasters. We felt like Lee County's action plan didn't go far enough in that regard. Now let me just step back and say, I think Lee County they had an excellent draft action plan. They did a very good job. It was one of the better action plans that I've read, and I've read quite a few of them over the years. But it certainly did not include all of the flexibility that you all, as the town of Fort Myers Beach, would ultimately want in that program. And so we have scoured the action plan. We've scoured HUD regulation and statute, looking for every conceivable avenue that you have to help, essentially to grease the skids so that you have an easier time of qualifying projects and of making these projects eligible for these funds ultimately. And so, again, that's all in a very technical soup here, because this is really written and aimed ultimately at HUD. These comments that are going to be submitted back to Lee County will ultimately have to submit these comments directly to HUD. And HUD will want specific answers from Lee County as to how they are planning to amend or change the action plan to meet these. And HUD often will say, well, wait a second, we don't think you've been responsive enough to these specific concerns, which we believe are valid concerns. And so really this is sort of the first step in a longer process to sort of planting a flag for Fort Myers Beach to ensure that you've stated your goals and objectives, that you've considered all of the avenues that will be available to you, and also, frankly, to ensure that you have that flexibility going forward, because we all know that priorities will change. I've never seen a community who didn't get 2 or 3 years down the road post-disaster, and some opportunity comes along, and that can take many forms. But when that opportunity comes along, you're going to want to have that flexibility to make sure you can be responsive to those opportunities. The other thing about housing funds in general is, we all understand housing is a significant unmet need. Housing is generally one of the largest unmet needs after a disaster, and that certainly holds true in the analysis of the unmet needs that Lee County provided. But housing in and of itself is not the sole path to a comprehensive disaster recovery. And so what we've tried to do here is really make sure that you also have those opportunities to do the other things. Housing programs can also be very, very difficult to administer. And oftentimes what we find in post-disaster environments is an action plan will go into HUD with great intentions to spend the money exactly as they've stated, but as the years roll by and money is unspent, HUD will come back and say, wait a second, these funds are not being drawn down. We're not seeing that this program is moving forward. We'd like you to consider reallocating a portion of the funds to another purpose. So this will really live in perpetuity as long as the funds last, because it's essentially stating your case for how ultimately Fort Myers Beach would like to go about having the flexibility they need to be able to utilize these funds in the most effective way.
Let me just ask you a question, because one
Yes,
thing
sir.
that, I went to a lot of the branch meetings, I've been to the, Resilient Lee meetings.
Yes.
It seems like we're all doing very high level stuff.
Right.
And even in the draft action plan, sooner or later, there's got to get the point where money is committed to projects on Fort Myers Beach. Where
Right.
we get an allocation. That doesn't come from this draft action plan, I take.
Correct, that does not. And so what this action plan does is it creates the vehicles by which that money ultimately will flow to projects. Once those programs, those vehicles are created through the action plan, that's when projects will start being created to tap into those programs. So what this is doing is trying to create the flexibility in the programs that you have a greater range of possibilities with the projects that you can qualify and receive funding for.
And I also realize that, Lee County, even before the storm, was considered one of the least affordable housing markets in the country.
Right.
And so there was a huge need within the county that would dwarf Fort Myers Beach. I mean,
That's right.
I could see it eating up all the money.
Yes.
Without a problem.
Well, in fact, I hope that I'm giving the right ratio here. I believe they identified 8 times as much unmet housing needs as they have total in the CDBG allocation. So you're absolutely correct. In all of the ways that they identify these unmet needs, the $1.1 billion doesn't even come close to satisfying the full range of unmet needs they've identified. And so it really becomes a prioritization then of making certain that you're deploying that money. I think in general terms, what we're recommending that you ask for here is ways to ensure that the housing funds that are dedicated to housing are more able to flow to the homeowners in Fort Myers Beach that may need that help. And then also to make sure that money that's not specific to housing is prioritized such that it will go to Fort Myers Beach. So things like infrastructure money, making sure that it comes here maybe rather than somewhere else. The addition of an economic revitalization allocation so that you have the specific resources that you will need to take on economic revitalization projects. And those projects may be known today and they may not be, but either way, ultimately, you don't have the ability to do them as it is written today. The other thing that was really important to us, and I don't want to lose sight of this, it's a relatively small amount of money in the grand scheme of things, but planning assistance. You know, we've specifically asked that they prioritize their selection criteria for how they distribute the planning money to take into account the hardest hit areas, such as Fort Myers Beach, and then provide you quickly and efficiently those planning funds, because oftentimes the planning exercises that you undertake immediately being funded by CDBG will help develop the projects that you ultimately apply for funding farther down the road within these programs. And so really, in many ways, that planning is the first step because that helps you create really your list of projects that sort of meet all these objectives that you have.
And I know when I attended some of the branch meetings, and I think I attended a planning branch meeting.
Yes.
The participants in the subject matter experts just seemed to dismiss doing any of that work in a non-LMI area.
Yeah.
So they went quickly through in the areas that they were somewhere far away from the beach, not on Sanibel, not on Fort Myers Beach. And it's a real issue because, like you said, it's not a lot of money. Planning is a very small portion of this pool, but it can go a long way. And you know, we have our area so decimated downtown. The other thing is the state's losing out a lot of tax revenue why our businesses are suffering.
No question. And, you know, I was so glad that I got to have the benefit of hearing the budget presentation because it further underscores a number of the points that we made here. You know, the difficulty in post-disaster environments often is that you have a second economic disaster 2 or 3 years removed from the initial disaster when all of the recovery spending, the individuals that are rebuying beds and washing machines and dryers and appliances and paying contractors, when all of that starts to taper off, oftentimes you'll see quite an economic downturn associated with that. And so one of the stated reasons in statute for these CDBG DR funds is to be able to provide you resources to help prevent that or help offset that. We didn't feel like the Lee County Action Plan and its current form went far enough to give you those funds. And frankly, you know, it certainly would not have made it easy for Fort Myers Beach to tap into the resources that you ultimately will need to bring about your recovery.
And I'll tell you another one of my fears, particularly with if we want to develop some kind of workforce housing program, which is something that we couldn't build on our own, is that down the road, and you say like if they allocate so much for workforce housing, down the road, if they're comparing our prices per door to somewhere else, then that's going to be a harder sell.
Correct.
Although what I've told you before, affordable housing and workforce housing are two different things because location matters for workforce housing.
It absolutely does. Yes, no question. And you know, to your broader point earlier, you know, pragmatically, one of the reasons that you often see these action plans look a lot like the normal annual CDBG program is because the same departments and the same people administer both. And so they have a process that works. They deal with it every year. They understand the rules and regulations. And then a special disaster allocation shows up, and they sort of do what they always do with CDBG funds. And those funds are certainly aimed at helping low-mod individuals, and that's a worthy goal. But the intention of these funds is not only to do that. It's also to be able to provide other means to meet unmet needs that there aren't other federal sources of funds to meet. And so in some ways, this CDBG DR becomes the gap filler in a disaster. It looks around at the area that was impacted, and it says, here are all the things that private insurance is handling. Here's all the things that FEMA Public Assistance or Hazard Mitigation is handling. Here are things that other infrastructure programs may be handling, road construction projects that may be coming from other federal agencies. And this money is there to fill the gaps. What's left after all of those things have been done that are not able to easily fit into any of those other funding streams, this is your opportunity to do that. And so, again,
And I
in
just-
some ways, sorry, go ahead.
And just the point to that, because the hazard mitigation grant program, which individuals can be used to lift their house up to flood or to rebuild above flood, up to $150,000. FEMA pays 3/4 of that, but this could be used as a match for the other quarter, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so it fills that gap like you were
That's
saying.
right. This is the gap filler. And in many ways, it makes it the most valuable recovery money that you have access to. The greater flexibility it has, the more valuable the money is to you ultimately, because all these other programs are incredibly prescriptive. You know, they are only going to do certain things to a certain extent. This allows for greater creativity and innovation on your part in really developing projects that can fit your local priorities and also qualify for these funds that would not be available to you under other federal funding sources. That's right.
Ashley,
Yes, sir.
couple things. First
Yes.
of all, that's probably the best overview I've heard of this whole program since I've been listening for the last few months, so nice job providing some context.
Sure.
I listened intently to an interview that Commissioner Ruane, who chairs the task force, gave, I believe, on Beach Talk Radio, where he talked about he envisions this $1.1 billion potentially increasing to $5, $8, $10 billion over the next few years. A, do you see that? And B, when, in a perfect world, which we don't live in, but when would you envision some of these actual, let's just start with the 1.1, when would you envision those dollars actually reaching Fort Myers Beach?
So the dollars essentially have been set aside for Lee County now in this initial $1.1 billion allocation. Congress always has the prerogative to go back and increase that through subsequent appropriations, and there certainly is precedent for that happening. I'll give you a perfect example of that. In Mississippi, the first CDBG disaster recovery allocation we received was not the final amount. We received some subsequent plus-ups into that program over time, and so that's certainly possible. Now, sort of the rest is politics, right? I don't know how much that would possibly be, but depending on the lobbying that's occurring up on Capitol Hill, it certainly has the potential to persist for years to come, and so that's certainly correct. The other thing I'll just quickly say, a lot of times what you'll see in these initial action plans is that the bulk of the funding is put toward housing, and as the recipient over time sort of identifies what those needs are, how many applicants they'll receive, and determines if they can spend all that money, they will subsequently make amendments to that plan all the time, reallocating money to other uses if it can't be drawn down in housing. Based on the quantification of need that Lee County has provided, I think there's probably a safe bet that a lot of this money will end up in housing from the get-go. And so it may be that ultimately there will be enough applications to fill this. And so in many ways, this is the time to make sure that you have sort of all of your requests in, because there may not be another bite at the apple necessarily on changing some of these eligibility requirements. Everything that we've asked for is available, allowable, and readily given by HUD in general terms. We're not asking for something here that's outside the bounds or outside of precedent. These are all things that HUD fully allows you to request. We're just asking Lee County essentially to request them, which they have not yet done in their draft.
Well, I just point out that, in the portal entry where anybody could put in information, my understanding going through and talking with people after we submitted some things, some of those are just not qualified.
That's right.
Like one thing is if you need to apply eminent domain anyway, you're not qualified.
Right.
So there's a lot of things that people request, but they're not really in the sphere for this. So I assume somewhere there we're narrowing down our requests to things that are, that are possible.
That's correct, and that will be an ongoing process. I mean, it is not unusual for your initial needs list or your initial project list to evolve over time as new realities surface and new opportunities surface. Obviously, Times Square is a priority for you guys. We've communicated a lot with Andy and the mayor. They've been excellent in giving us some great insight into what the priorities of Fort Myers Beach is. And so we took the actual initial project list that's already been created and continuing to evolve and said if we were trying to qualify this specific project under the action plan as it exists in draft with Lee County, would it qualify? And oftentimes the answer was maybe, but it might be tough, or no, it wouldn't qualify. What we've given you here is something to make sure that those projects would qualify.
Mr. Town Manager, I'm not trying to cut off debate, but I just want to get some direction. Are you looking for the council just to consent to these recommendations?
Correct. We've got, excuse me, we've got a deadline of Tuesday to be able to submit this formally to the committee. And so we need consensus that, yes, move forward. It doesn't really have to be a vote. We just need to be able to take draft off and put it in a format that's, official and presentable.
Yeah, I think the presentation is excellent, and I support your conclusions. Any additional questions or comments from my colleague?
I would just say I'd like to reserve the right to at least talk a little more with the guys, because this is the first time I've seen this.
Sure.
And because we've already talked about some things, I'd like to make sure that the language is in here so that some of our priorities, like for a resilient hub, would be.
Can we, Councilor Veach, since we're together and they have a deadline on Tuesday, can we offer consent with the proviso that you may have some additional thoughts?
That'd be good.
Since we're all together, is everybody okay with that?
And I'll provide you with my cell number. You're welcome to call me anytime, and we can dig into it in depth.
All right, I think you have your direction, Mr. Town Manager. Anybody else have any additional thoughts or questions? Very good.
Thank you, Ash.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you
Great.
guys.
We'll move on to the special exceptions, variances, CPDs. I was going to ask the town attorney just to give us a little color on. She's actually implemented some new phraseology and structure to our variance process. I wanted her to talk a little bit about variances. I don't want to have we had a long meeting on Monday. Don't want to go on too long. But if you could talk a little bit about some of the highlights of when and how someone comes into a variance. And
Sure.
and then also-
these are actually currently in your code.
Yep, I
Okay.
just don't think they've been
And-
highlighted.
Yeah, I wanted to, because I'm getting some questions about what's the difference between a variance and what's, and a special exception. And I'll do an overview of that because sometimes they get confused. A variance is something you can ask for a variance as long as it's not a use variance. And a use variance has to do with, for instance, if you wanted to put a commercial business in, for instance, a residential zone. It's how you're using the property as opposed to what is actually constructed on the property. Building elements, that sort of thing is what variances have to do with. And you can ask for a variance unless there is a provision, and I honestly didn't see any in your code that says you can't ask for the variance. So the rule is if there is a requirement in the code, you can ask for a variance with regard to it. And there are the considerations that are set out. I don't know if y'all have these in front of you. I don't necessarily need to read them if you've got them in front of you. And that's what you consider, which includes the testimony from the public, which is very important. And then you have to make findings. If you can't find each one of these items to exist, then you shouldn't be granting the variance. They are pretty broad brush. Your findings in your code, I really like them because they're a little more broad brush than some municipalities' provisions are. And the difference between a variance and a special exception is that some of your zoning categories call out particular uses which might be allowed in that particular zoning category. And I guess the classic ones that are in most codes, for instance, in a residential district, often you're allowed to have a school or a church, or sometimes a hospital or something. It depends upon what is in that, what is called out in the zoning category. If in fact there is a special exception that's actually listed in the zoning category, there is, let me step back for a second. In zoning categories, there are permitted uses. Oftentimes, there are prohibited uses, and then there are special exceptions. Some cities call them conditional uses. Some cities use both those terms. But you use the special exception, and those, there is actually a presumption under your code that they should be allowed if you decide that they're in an appropriate place, appropriate location, and it basically works with what's on the ground. Okay?
That's great. And Sarah, I'll just give you a heads up. I'm going to ask you in a second, after I ask Becky a question, just think about explaining how, if someone is told by a contractor they need a variance, just walk us through what a resident would do, how much does it cost, what do they do procedurally, et cetera. But in the interim, while you're looking that up, Becky, I'm curious because I've heard comments like this. The various variances that we've granted post-Ian, do they set any kind of each individual variance, do they set a legal precedent of any kind that will impact other variances that are requested, or are they considered unique and on a case-by-case basis?
Each one is unique, and it's on a case-by-case basis. That does not mean that someone will not come up to you and say, "But you granted it to my neighbor."
Right, but we don't.
You're not required.
We're not
to.
exposed legally.
Legally, it is not precedent setting.
That's really helpful. Sarah, somebody's told by their contract, "Oh, you're going to need a variance for this." What happens in your world, and how does the resident or business person if they've never done it before, what goes on?
So I have reached
And
out.
how painful is it?
I've reached out to Kendra to find out the costs because I don't know exactly what they are right now. I have a general idea, but I don't want to misquote that. They would apply for a variance or a special exception, or if they need to do a CPD. There are 3 different applications. There's the basic public hearing application that everybody has to fill out, and then there are different supplements based on what they're applying for. So if they have a variance, it's one supplement. A special exception is another supplement. The CPD is a third supplement. So whichever, there's the basic and then the additional supplement. Each of those require the applicant to respond to the questions that you see in the code section that are required for the findings. And we always encourage the applicant to do a good job and think about what they're doing. And we will assist them if they don't understand what those questions mean. But we really try not to answer those questions for them because this needs to come from them.
Does the applicant need an attorney? Can their contractor help them? Can they do it on their own? What do you recommend, and what's normal practice?
I would say that some cases are more complicated than others. A typical variance or a special exception usually will not require a land use attorney unless it's a very complicated case. Oftentimes CPDs and RPDs may, and that's just because there are a lot of other moving parts. I mean, if you think about Margaritaville, while that was a very complex one, we do have a lot of details, and sometimes there are ownership issues also. So depending on the complexity of the case, they may want to do that. And sometimes if it gets very complicated and they ask us, we would advise them to do that because it's just in their best interest. While it's an additional cost, if it's something that they're pursuing and they, a lot of these become very expensive projects, it makes sense for them to invest up front.
Becky, you were going to talk about a couple other items, I believe. And by the way, feel free to chime in if folks have questions.
So just to kind of wrap up the initial thing, so pretty much it's a similar process whether you're applying for a variance, special exemption, or a CPD. It's you file forms and you have your public hearing, and there's not a huge difference between them.
Yes, the standards are different, but the standards, I would suggest that when we have variances come before you and when we have special exceptions, whatever, that a copy of the standards be given to you in your agenda packet. I think that that would be a positive thing. And then you'll have them because nobody's going to memorize them. And yes, I did want to mention a couple of other things. For instance, I was very happy to see in your code a development agreement with deviations. Apparently, you haven't in the past made use of that tool that's in your toolbox, but that actually might be something, an innovative way. I've heard individual council members talk about wanting to allow innovative development in certain instances, and that would be a way to make that happen. And as I said, it hasn't been used because there's a requirement that you basically lay out the procedures for that.
How would that differ from a CPD?
That would be, it would be less, cumbersome. It would not require a rezoning. It would not, I've heard, not members of the board, but I've heard members of the community being concerned about spot zoning, because you do not need to change the zoning for that. And you can accomplish essentially the same thing. I think it would be quicker because you wouldn't have to go through the rezoning procedures.
So with this, in essence, I know we were supposed to have a conversation on pink zones today, or presentation, which is basically postponed, but would this way of doing things allow an easier, I don't want to say an easier way, but a more consistent change than identifying such
Yes.
things as pink zones?
I have research, and I can honestly tell you I've never represented any local government that had the pink zones. So I did research it, and I see some ways that those possibly could be challenged. One is the spot zoning issue. Another is actually creating a the council actually deciding what should go here, as opposed to the owner coming in and saying, I have this idea, which is what the CPD, that's how that starts, and the development agreement with deviations would also start that way. The pink zone, you go through several steps, which I think we could accomplish the same idea with the development agreement with deviations. The only city I've represented that has development agreements with deviations is Naples. They recently changed the composition of the city council to more of they're not anti-development, but they're leaning more that direction. And they got rid of their development agreements with deviations. And I think it's a great tool.
So I'm just still kind of a little confused about how this fits into the puzzle compared to like a CPD. Is it more general? I mean, when someone does a development agreement, are they not laying out the same kind of specificity with their project that they are with a CPD? Or is it just is it just allowing more use or more? I'm kind of confused at how it fits in.
It is very similar. It is very similar. And
But less time consuming, or
it
less
is less
costly?
time consuming because you would not have to go through the rezoning process.
It would still have to come in front of council.
Oh,
but-
yes.
but
Oh,
in a-
absolutely. And before the LPA.
So, give me an example of how this would be used.
Okay. Let's say somebody in the commercial district had, I'm not a developer, and I don't have clever ideas about what to do with property. But they come in with something that's not going to be detrimental to anything, and they want to, let's say, put a restaurant on the ground floor, and they want to put something up top and whatever. Yeah. And what they want to do doesn't exactly fit in with our code. Okay? Rather than changing our entire code, they can come in and say, and it might not be something which would go well through the variance process, for instance, because you can't have a use variance that I mentioned, because there might be a use that might be innovative. I don't know what it might be. But they could come in and say, I have this piece of property. This is exactly what I want to do with it. And if y'all think it's a good idea and the LPA will look at it and they'll have the same process, it looks like a really good idea. It's not going to hurt anybody. We'll notify people in the area, get comments, and we can do a development agreement which lays it all out and allows it. And with the development agreement with deviations, this is the reason for the deviations, every item that is different from the base zoning, it has to be specifically stated. In other words, the front setback is going to be decreased by 2 feet. And the height's going to be increased by 1 foot. Something like that. And if there'll be an analysis of it, so everybody can see what is going to be changed from the original code. Those are safeguards that we're not sliding something in that the public doesn't fully understand how it doesn't comply. And there is a presumption under your code that if something is not called out as a deviation, then they can't do it unless it's compliant with the code. So it's probably the most transparent sort of process you can go through. And then if it passes, then they can build it. And they don't have to have a pink zone with a rezoning of it first. And then on that, you have to create a zoning category for that particular pink zone. And like I say, I've never used a pink zone process before. But from what I can tell on the internet, it's pretty complex, and it's kind of a lot of wasted time and effort.
And I'll just to kind of keep on this vein. So, like an example, let's say someone has a commercial property that they're in right now, like in our CV zoning district, the use is restricted to whatever the use was before, right? So if they had a shop, then they'd be allowed retail, but they wouldn't be allowed to put a restaurant in or something like that. Now, if they wanted to do a mixed use, so they wanted to put a shop back in and put housing on top of it, then this would be an avenue for you, because I don't think we have a mixed use category in our.
Actually, all of our districts allow residential, so we do have mixed use, and every place that commercial is allowed, residential is also allowed. So we, in essence, do have mixed use. It just isn't called out specifically that way.
Right. So I guess back to kind of an example, if someone, let's say they had a shop, they want to put a restaurant and housing on it, and they want some variances to be able to do that. So if they want to go through without this process, they'd have to get a special exemption for the use. They'd have to get a variance for whatever the building they're doing, you're saying to do this, it'll be one process?
Yes, it would, one process for the whole thing.
Right, right. I think I understand now, thank you.
Okay.
So is this something that is already in our code, or would
It
it? ha-
is. It's already in your
So
code. I was
but we just
very
haven't
surprised.
Utilized it.
I have been told that it has a requirement that you have to adopt procedures to use it, and I asked for the procedures, and they said that we've never done it.
Yeah, the code basically directs that the town can do it, but we need to develop some procedures. We've never been asked to look at this portion of the code.
I'm asking.
Well,
I'm asking.
I would like to put forward that, we've had some discussions about pink zones, but I think more to your point is we have a lot of code sections that just don't work. I mean, overall, it's not like little fix will do it, or we'll put a Band-Aid pink zone across it. I think that we really need to look at the entire code and do a complete overhaul all at once. This morning, and Chad's going to get up here later, but this morning I was having a conversation regarding trees and stormwater and fill and how all of those go together when you're looking at how water exists, stormwater on a site, and how we really need to look at all of those, despite them being in separate sections of the code, we need to look at them together. That also plays into setbacks, it plays into impervious surface, so I think we need to do a big look and a deep dive into our code and not try to overlay something without doing a thorough analysis of what we have and what needs to change based on what we already know is a problem.
So, Sarah, could we possibly do that simultaneously so that we can keep moving forward on things? So, in other words, create and adopt procedures for the development agreements, but simultaneously look at all the different codes that are maybe in conflict or with each other.
If there's an interest to do the development agreement with deviations, staff can look into, or if the attorney already has some knowledge of how this works, into what that language might look like, and bring that forward. But looking at all the other components, I'm going to recommend that we try not to make little change, which is what we've been doing for a long time. It makes it really complicated for everybody out in TV land who's watching, but also for staff. And a lot of the components that we change are not cohesive. So I want, if we can, I really want us to do like a hard focus for a couple months. We're bringing up the comp plan really soon, and we're hoping to do a transmittal to the state in October if we're lucky. It's got to get through the LPA, and then it needs to get through you guys one round. But after that, I'd really like to do a deep dive on the land development code and look at what we need to change to make things work so that we don't have so many variances coming before us, so that we don't have all these questions, so that we have all the opportunity to do the things that the town has wanted to do for a long time, but doing these little piecemeal changes makes it complicated.
And I totally agree with that. What I'm trying to get to, though, is that we don't become the bottleneck, we don't slow down the process for rebuild and that kind of thing. So that's why I said if we could do this simultaneously, and I wholeheartedly agree with the deep dive because I've watched every LPA meeting and understand all the issues, or have seen what all the issues have come forward. I just don't want to be the bottleneck.
And I kind of agree. One thing that's the point is that, you want to make sure things are done right and in the long term that people have clear guidance and have real clarity. But you also don't want necessarily people have to wait for months. Because like you said, first you have to get the comprehensive plan, have to send it to the state, right, wait for them to approve it. And that can be quite a...
And I'm not saying that we wait to look at the land development code until we hear back from the state. I just want us to have a solid understanding of what you guys want the comprehensive plan to be before we start on that code. If the state comes back and says you have to change some things, we can change some things. It's not going to be a complete overhaul. It won't change the direction.
Yeah, but I will also kind of concur with Karen here that I think that if we're not changing the code, we're just developing some procedures, then we're really not interfering with that code, and we're giving people another tool in the short term to get things moving. And I think too, the whole idea of the pink zone, to me, that only really makes sense if you have a template, if you have models of what people can do so that it's known. But just the pink zone on its own, just to think that you're going to, call it pink zone and have lower, lower the burden of planning and all that, because we still have the Florida Building Code we have to comply to. I mean, it's not, I don't see a huge benefit from
Right.
just the pink zone.
Well, and I think the reason for the pink zone that it came about is no one really knew or understood about this development agreement deviation. And so the pink zone was a way to help with the code orientation, if you will. But if we have this other, we don't need a pink zone.
Right, maybe it solves a lot of the same problems.
Exactly.
It sounds as if there's consent by the council to proceed on both tracks. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, for sure, there needs to be a deep dive into the land development code and revise that. Sometimes, though, one size does not fit all. And so, and you've already got the tool there. So I would suggest, going
think-
at them at the same time.
Yep, and I think
And-
you've got agreement by the council. Councilor King
Definitely.
agrees as well, so you have consent to proceed exploring the criteria that you're talking about, Town
Yes.
Attorney, and then also Sarah, obviously, we've got a lot of work to do on the deeper dive. Okay?
Along so many courts. You had previously asked the cost of a variance and the cost of a special exception. A variance is $1,800 plus $500 per additional variance. A special exception is $3,800.
Wow.
So that's our pricing. Is that the norm? Is that consistent with other municipalities? How does that lay out? I'm looking at Becky for this.
I've worked in
But
several communities.
I think all these variances take a lot of staff time.
Yeah,
Draw.
I've worked in several communities, and usually they try to price them in such a way, and I would say that this is fairly average. They try to price them in such a way that it covers staff time and the variety of things that we have to do. So, another item that I wanted to discuss with you today, because it came up earlier this week, there are about half a dozen condominiums on the island who have pools that are partially within the environmentally critical zoning district. They extend beyond the current CCCL, which is the line that runs along, behind most of the condos and houses along the beach. So most of them were built up to it, but some of them, I think, must have been prior to the CCCL coming into effect. So they have pools that extend over that. Our code currently says that that existing major structures that were built partially or fully seaward of the 1978 coastal construction control line are reconstructed. They shall be rebuilt landward of this line. And then it talks about exceptions through the plan development, and they have to prove that it's not going to be impacted by the shoreline. It's not going to impact the shoreline. Then it goes on to say that repairs to existing primary structures in the EC are permitted without a special exception only if the repairs do not exceed 25% of the value of the structure. Expansion of existing primary structures in the EC district are not permitted without a special exception. And then repairs to accessory structures in the EC zoning district are not permitted. All of these pools would be considered accessory structures, accessory major structures within the EC zoning district, and if they require repairs, they cannot be rebuilt there, or they cannot be repaired there.
Sarah, just a quick question. It's a very interesting issue. I'm curious. These select entities, which this is going to create tremendous hardship for them. Will that CCL be impacted? I've heard discussion that after the beach renourishment's complete, we'll use Leonardo Arms for an example, that they'll have additional 200 feet of sand in front of their property, a beach in front of their property. Will that affect the CCL, and will it affect this issue?
It depends on where they are on the beach, because the beach is going to look different in all the different places. And these are all up and down the beach, so there's not a specific location where these are. So they would be very differently impacted by that, I would assume.
And it's also a 1978 triple CL, so it's
Yeah.
been around for a while.
What's your recommendation? I'm sorry, John.
Go ahead. No, go
I'm
ahead,
just gonna
finish
ask
your-
a question. What's your recommendation to the council at this point?
So my request of the council is that you let me know if you are interested in changes of that code, because currently it's a flat out, you can't. There isn't an option for a special exception. You can get a special exception for, I read the part about primary structures that are damaged more than 25%, and there's also a list of things that are allowed by special exception, and they include dune walkovers, on-grade paths, very small structure, steps down.
I can't imagine, and I'll yield to Councilor King because he's in the same boat as I am in terms of our background, but I can't imagine these condos have the flexibility to move their pool.
They don't.
Yeah, so I mean, I would support something that tries to assist them.
What did you use to determine that they were over the coastal construction line? Because this issue came up specifically at the condo I live in. Not about the pool necessarily, but
The CCCL map,
from the county, right?
yes.
But can't the condos then come out and hire a surveyor? Because we were told that our condo building was over the coastal construction line, one of our condo buildings, and that wasn't the case. And we paid for the surveyor to come out, and the map was inaccurate.
Well, in this instance,
It cost us $14,000, but
in this instance, they will have to do a survey. They have not submitted a survey as of yet. So we were reliant on our GIS and the Lee County map.
yeah, and unfortunately, that's probably going to have to be the option, Jim. But like I said, it cost us $14,000 that we didn't feel we needed to go there, but it was cheaper than tearing down the building and moving it.
Well, like I said, in this instance, they have to get the survey anyway. So if that helps them or
Yeah.
it doesn't help them, at least they'll know, and it doesn't cost them anything extra because that has to be done.
Okay.
Now,
Does that help, Jim? Or?
Yeah, I think my sense is, I don't want to speak for my colleagues, but I think Councilor King and I would agree that certainly we want to prepare to at least explore a path for some of these folks, particularly if they've got a hardship where they just physically can't move their pool, I would think.
I would think to some degree too, like the 50% rule, it probably depends on how much of a repair they're doing. If it's pretty much a tear it down anyway.
Well, and the code also doesn't specify what exactly a repair is. I know that there's one condominium that has a pool that's partially over the CCCL, but their pool doesn't require any repairs. They've already had engineers come out and check, and everything is structurally fine. All they're going to do is drain it, clean it, and repaint it, and they're calling it a day. They don't require a permit to do those things, and everything else is outside of the CCCL. So in that instance, they can keep it there because they're not really doing a repair. It's the ones that might be impacted, like if they have some cracks that they have to, do something different, if they have to put in a new shell, anything like that. And it doesn't currently give any percentage in the code. It just says repairs. So in our mind, that's anything that requires a permit. But if there would be interest in changing that to a percentage, if there would be a requirement that under a certain percentage is allowed, like the same way that the primary structures is written. If it's under 25%, they can do it without a special exception. If it's over 25%, they're required to get a special exception.
Well, I certainly understand Councilor Veach's point. If the building's completely gone, that obviously creates an open slate. But if the building is still there, and we're literally telling somebody that they have to move an existing pool where they probably don't have a lot of options, I would certainly want to find a path where we could help them, at least from my opinion.
Yeah, and I think, the scenario, I think that if it's really close to the water, the fact that the water is impacting it, and maybe it's structurally unsound, that would be a case where you certainly want them to probably move it back. But if it's just like you said, you get a couple of cracks in a pool, do a minor repair, that seems a little excessive.
I totally agree. I mean, I think, maybe the percentage, if the building's there and the pool is just damaged or the building's gone, we're totally talking, of course you have to change it. But I agree that we should put some verbiage in to make it more feasible.
Okay. I can bring this forward to, I will not be here at the next town council hearing. I could bring it to the first town council hearing in September, potentially.
That would be great. And let's hold off at any enforcement action against those folks until.
Oh, and
yeah.
there is no enforcement. They're
Okay.
just coming to us. They're submitting a development order, and we're going through the process of what's going to need to happen.
Very good.
So if it's your personal schedule that keeps you from attending, can we send Jason Green?
Yeah,
If
that
that's
would be-
okay with the council?
yeah. If
If
he's
he's
available.
available.
Yes, if he's available.
And then one thing that also kind of makes me think is I know that looking at a map along Times Square, that there's sections of a lot of the businesses on Times Square that are actually over that are in the C zone as well, including pretty much all of what the Pierside Grill. What's the path for those places? I mean, a lot of them have seawalls that are up, or like with the Pierside Grill, there's a whole structure there.
So the way the code was written, if it's a minor structure, so something that basically is frangible under wind and wave, then they can put it there with a special exception. The code only allows any existing major structures to be rebuilt under 25% without a special exception, and then over that, it's a special exception to get it rebuilt. But if it's, it says, built partially or fully seaward of the 1978, so they would have that option.
Now, with like the Pierside Grill, they have all the foundation there. I mean, does that just stay there forever, or is there a trigger that would have to be removed and rehabilitated, or?
I'm not sure. That is not covered in my section of the code. That may be something that is required per the environmental regulations on the beach, but it's not anything in zoning.
All right, thank you.
Okay, let's move on. Item H, again, we'll do H, I, and J relatively together. Chad, I assume you're on deck. I'll yield to the town manager on that, but let's just set the table for this again. This is not a debate on the tree ordinance or the vegetation, proposed ordinance on vegetation and trees, or on the management district's request to update the town water conservation and water shortage ordinances. We have 2 new counselors. We have 2 other counselors who have aged since we've last discussed this. And so the goal is to tell us what is in this ordinance. And that's the purpose of our exercise today. Then if we decide to bring it forward, we can have the debate and do all the requisite discussion and public input.
And
But
just
thi-
as you know, as you kind of insinuated, that this has been in our view for some time. It's been around for, I think even previous councils. It's gone through the paces. A lot of it was, I think one of them already had its first reading, I think.
I think that's right, Bill.
Yeah.
Chad, I'll be right back in 30 seconds. But go ahead, please.
Okay. Chad Schutz, Town of Fort Myers Beach, environmental staff. So we have the tree ordinance. If you have questions on it, please feel free to ask. The direction from Murph to put this ordinance in front of you today with proposed changes to defining exotic trees based on the Florida exotic plant list, particularly Category 1, such as like Brazilian pepper, earleaf acacia, beach napuka, which is the scaevola, kind of the banana leaf.
Sounds like a party.
You see, well, it's from Hawaii, so there you go, luau. So defining these exotics and trying to get them, we have a real opportunity right now with as much as the vegetation's been knocked down to try and make a good college try to eradicate exotics on the island right now before the wet seasons come. the more we water them, the more they'll grow. Anyway, so defining those, and then also removing an exemption that allows homeowners to remove up to 3 protected trees annually. As you can imagine, a lot of lots don't even have 3 protected trees, so a homeowner can quickly go down to 0 trees on their lot without much that we can do about it. A tree is defined as a 10-foot tree, so it's not, just an up-and-coming sprout. So removing that exemption or limiting it, or maybe putting some criteria around it. We could also, staff could provide kind of a verification of exemption when tree permits are required. We already do a lot of this with borings, when people want to do borings and they say, hey, Lee County's requiring us to ask you if a tree permit's required. We look at either through aerials or on-site inspections and say, hey, where they're going to do their work, it's not going to affect the trees, no permit required, and provide that to them at no cost. Another facet of what MRF or what staff was proposing for the tree protection code was requiring removal of those defined exotic vegetation and trees when they are obtaining a tree removal permit. At present, somebody can say, I want to remove this oak and have Brazilian pepper all through their house or all through their property, or an Australian pine on their property. If they're wanting to remove some trees, they should also remove the exotic trees and vegetation that are on their property as a condition of that permit. And lastly, it creates a tree fund and defines a methodology for appraising tree values. I can let Sarah speak to this a little bit, and I can speak to it as well. The tree fund, it does provide a good mechanism for the town to raise money for vegetation on town properties. Having said that, it allows for property owners to basically buy their way out of having to have trees on their property. So just getting some direction on how y'all feel about those things.
And the idea was then that money would be used to put trees on public property
Yes,
or
sir.
anywhere else.
So the problem that I've seen with this method in communities is that it, like he said, it allows people to just not put trees on their property and pay to put them somewhere else, which is not beneficial to the community necessarily. Additionally, we have to put it on public property, and the town doesn't have a ton of public property, so we end up with an inability to install enough trees. However we create the fund, we may have a legal obligation to plant these use these funds for trees, and we may not have a place to put them. So I'm not a huge fan of the tree fund option, just because it has some unintended consequences.
So you have a highlighted version. It's highlighting that markup in there. I don't know if y'all want to go through it, or if you have had a chance to already and have some questions or concerns with some of these proposals that have come out of the MRF committee meetings.
And again, today's not the debate day, it's more educational, so
Okay.
as best as you could just inform us, we'll wrestle in the future with this stuff in the interest of time.
Yes, sir.
I think any other additional questions for Chad? Did you already do the proposed vegetation and trees?
Yeah, so we'll move on to that. That's the next item.
I do have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
What's the ultimate focus of updating this tree ordinance, changing the tree ordinance? What are we trying to get at?
So we want to preserve trees. Trees have a lot of beneficial properties that benefit the community as a whole. So how do we incentivize and require trees that are native, that are large trees, that don't necessarily prohibit someone from building on their property? How do we try and keep those? Because some people will say, well, trees are messy, or they drop a lot of stuff, and I don't like them, and I don't want to have to upkeep it. I don't want to, that kind of complaint. And beauty's in the eye of the beholder. But others would see that tree as a beneficial use for heat island effects and wildlife habitat, etc. So it's, what are the values that y'all want to instill for the community, and also another impetus for this, bring this in front of y'all, is the removal of exotics. So getting that tree, whenever somebody asks for a tree removal permit, as a condition of that, you need to remove these exotics, which are causing issues. If we have an Australian pine over here, then we'll have 100 Australian pines out on the beach if we didn't do anything about it. Same thing with scaevola or beach napuka with the banana leaf. You'll see that pops up, and all of a sudden it will take over the beach. Brazilian pepper, there's a few lots that had Brazilian pepper, and you can see now they're starting to proliferate, and it will take over.
Yeah, and when they call them invasive, there's a reason, because they will take over everyone's yard. Brazilian peppers, the birds like to get the seeds, and you can get trees all over the place far away from where the original host was.
Yeah, so to put it short, encourage native trees and discourage the exotic vegetation.
Did Ian take care of some of these issues, or I know they did at Islands End?
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, right now we have there's probably has not been this little native or exotic vegetation on the island in decades or more, just because Ian kind of flattened everything. Usually the native stuff grows back better than the invasive stuff that gets wiped out. So there is an opportunity right now to kind of give it a knockdown punch right now in terms of exotics.
And also, they're coming back. I mean, in our yard, we've never had the scaevola, and we have one growing now.
Yep. Yeah, it's the disbursement effect. Yep.
Chad, I heard a condo president the other day say that, many of the condos literally have to start from scratch on landscaping, and they've got a tremendous amount of land that they're going to try to landscape. And he mentioned that the town has like 27 pages of regulations with respect to doing that landscaping. Any advice to the condos that have a pretty significant amount of land, in terms of how to be compliant, how to obviously be economical, be sensitive to the issues we talked about earlier with Kathy? Just, what are these condo boards, what should they be thinking about?
My understanding, and Sarah may be able to speak to this a bit better, is as a condo, multifamily, or commercial property, you usually have a landscape plan that you build to whenever you first created that condo, as part of your development order, and then you're expected to maintain that in perpetuity until you want to change it otherwise in accordance with the code. So I'm not sure.
The plan that they submitted, that they had submitted and utilized prior to Ian would remain the plan post-Ian?
Sarah, can you help me out with that?
If they have one, I don't know that the town would have a problem with them re-implementing that. If they haven't changed other portions of their property, some have, put in additional amenities or parking areas. They may consider updating that to make it more Florida-friendly. A lot of the older ones that were built probably had some less Florida-friendly, more input-intensive plants. They may consider making them need less irrigation, less fertilizer, less pesticides, better for the community. So I would recommend that they look at what the requirements are. And
where would they find that, Sarah?
Well, the section of the code is chapter 10.
Yep.
And I don't find the town's landscaping ordinance to be particularly cumbersome compared to a lot of communities. And we are interested in, looking at ways to improve it. So, if people think that they want to put in something that is better than what our code says, come forward with it. We're going to be looking at the codes. We're going to be trying to update things. So if there's a better way to do it, I don't think we necessarily have a problem with it. But they need to look at the code first, and they probably need to hire a landscape architect to make sure that they're doing it the best way for the future, because they want something that doesn't require a lot of work.
That's something I was thinking when she said, I mean, for a lot of these places, they have quite a bit of land. They're not going to be doing it themselves. They're going to be hiring somebody. And there are vendors out there who just deal with native plants. But then there's the other regulations about flood, stormwater and all that, which come into which really don't have too much to do with the trees.
Well, and that's why I said earlier that we want to look at all the different parts of the code to make sure everything matches up. If there's a way to maybe require more or give the option that there's more intensive landscaping and less fill, and then they don't have to provide the same type of stormwater. We want to look at this in a creative way that's good for the community going forward.
But
So
from a practical standpoint, what does a condo board do? Do they meet with you? Do they meet with Chad? Do they have to submit something in advance of a meeting? I mean, what's the process for a condo board to interact with a town that wants to do a complete, new landscaping plan for their development?
That'd be an LDO.
yeah, it would be a limited review development order. They can reach out to the town.
What's a limited review land? What's
It's a limited review development order. It's less intensive than a development order. It's like you have existing layout of your property. You just want to make some changes to it. So it's less intensive than a full development order. They would reach out to us, tell us what they want to do. Reach out to staff, and they can ask us, we are looking at doing this, can we meet with you? Or if they can come in with a plan, a concept, that really helps us. If they could send it to us in advance, then we have a little bit of time to look at it. Then we can evaluate, okay, how does this comply with the code? How does it not comply with the code? Is this better than our code? It gives us a little bit of time, and then we can meet with them and talk with them about it and provide advice for them to go forward. And that's not a review, that's a pre-application. And then they can figure out what they need to do going forward.
Okay. Keep moving here. Have you already addressed the ordinance for vegetation and trees?
No, sir, not yet.
Do you want to just kind of hit the highlights of that?
Yes, sir. All right, so right now there's no current vegetation and tree requirements for single-family home construction. We get questions all the time, hey, what does the town require for, this home? We want to re-landscape, and the answer is there's no landscaping code right now for single-family homes. So we are seeking direction from town council with regards to any tree and vegetation requirements for single-family home construction, including things like trees. Do we want to require trees? Would it be based on some sort of size or setbacks associated with the lot? Would we be requiring any canopy or palm trees?
Is there a proposed ordinance that
No,
it's
sir.
already been drafted?
I think it would be more, I would rather get some direction from y'all to see if this is even something that y'all want to pursue before we put any time and effort into it.
I would just say, in the interest of time and staff resources, if there are other communities that are doing something that is practical and makes sense, instead of us sort of reinventing the wheel, I would just see what other communities in the area are doing.
I have, and
Okay.
that's where I got these kind of bullet points to see if y'all want to comment on each one. Good idea, Chad. Bad idea, Chad, or anything like that. So if I can just read these off.
Sure, go ahead.
And so again, are we going to require trees? Would we be requiring single-family homes to remove exotics when they're constructing? Would we be requiring drought-resistant ground cover versus, golf club, style grass that requires a lot of water and vegetation? Would we allow artificial plastic, ground cover like artificial turf, etc.? May have rubber associated with it next to waterways. Would we require beachfront properties to install dune vegetation with single-family home construction? What would we do with wetland? We have homes adjacent to wetlands or homes adjacent to waterways. Are we requiring maybe mangrove planters on seawalls, or any kind of wetland restoration whenever they're next to there?
And there's no requirements currently on the books, Chad?
With mangroves, mangroves are one of 3 different options they can do for whenever they install a seawall. There's riprap, there's grasses, and there's mangroves. Most people just apply riprap. You do see some over there at the new Junkanoo restaurant. I believe if you look to the right, there's an example of like mangrove planters that they've done over there, where you kind of have a culvert that's, you chop it, place it, plant the mangrove in there.
I thought mangroves took the place of a seawall. You could have one or the other.
No, you can have both. You can have
Counselor
both.
Veach,
It definitely does. For shoreline stabilization, it is a great natural shoreline option, and it can, and people do absolutely use that. Sometimes they just do riprap and let the mangroves grow. There's several different combinations.
Do you know, Counselor Veach or Chad, has Murph come up with actual language?
I think Murph has reviewed this, haven't they? Because I know that we have our master gardener, and we have, a master naturalist that have all looked at these things and come up with comments.
Yep, so there's several pages of suggestions, and
I think, in the interest of time, Chad, I think these are important issues, but if Murph could come up with actual draft language of a proposed ordinance, and then we could consider that and debate it. We'd have something in front of us for us to debate each one of these talking points, as thoughtful and important as they may be today. Probably not the best use of time, considering we've probably got, some of us have a learning curve on some of these items. So keep the powder dry on that, and if we could have, assuming Councilor Veach is okay with.
Well, I think the next probably, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Chad, but usually the next place to go is that Chad would take the suggestions that Murph made, and then actually, and whatever other sample code he can get from other jurisdictions, and then come up with a proposed ordinance with the changes on it that we would then bring in front of the council as an agenda item.
I think that would save a lot of time, and probably people with more subject matter expertise would have input into that.
Is that all right, Chad?
yes,
You got nothing else going
I'll
on,
work with
Chad?
it. Yeah, nothing else to do right there. We'll work with Sarah and try and come up with something as the time and resources come available.
So I have one other question on, because Bill mentioned that all these invasive plants that maybe you never even had before are all over your property now due to the hurricane. I feel bad for people if they now have to go to the expense of removing these invasive plants when it came through the hurricane. Is there any kind of funding that could be used for that to help people get rid of these?
So I have a couple of high schoolers that play soccer, and I usually like to try and get them some volunteer hours and maybe go and patrol the beach. And we've done that in the CWA in the last few years. We could definitely look at some volunteer programs, and maybe the master gardeners can help us, and then Keep Lee County Beautiful is another option to try and reach out to property owners where the actual invasive plants are on their property proper, and we need to ask permission to go and chainsaw massacre their property, or just out on the beach and take care of it, and snipping it and taking care of it that way.
Yeah, they're definitely much easier to handle when they're small.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And
Nip
to
it in
get
the bud.
ahead of it. So, and to get ahead of it. So I think that would be something we really need to look at
Yes,
quickly.
ma'am.
And like we just mentioned, I think at one of the last meetings, maybe Monday, that the Florida Master Gardeners went through and surveyed what they could see from the street all up and down the island. Now, how much of that is still standing, I don't know.
Not much.
But there are certainly some hot spots
Yep.
that were pointed out.
Yep.
Chad, do you have one or two talking points on item J?
Sure.
Because I
So,
understand this is pretty simple, as I understand it. Most other communities around us have adopted it already.
Yeah,
Is
we're
that-
one of the last municipalities. The Water Management District would really love for us to adopt these irrigation standards for watering the lawn, as well as some water shortage verbiage to be in sync with the Water Management District.
And this comes into play just during a drought, or does this affect the island when there isn't a drought?
So the irrigation is kind of a year-round thing, whereas the water shortage is more drought conditions. So
And
it's
I-
two separate ordinances.
And I think there wasn't really much distinction you already had. We're taking a model ordinance provided right by the
Yeah,
Water
it's
Management
based
District?
on the state model ordinance and a few tweaks, but it's,
If you
I don't
could,
think it's revolutionary.
yeah, if we could have the model ordinance superimposed on our existing ordinance, and have it redlined so council could see what those changes are, if they're minor and so forth, I have no problem with moving that forward.
Yes, sir.
I don't know if that's something you could pass along to the lawyers, or,
We'll see what we can do.
Just as a comparison, when I was in Surfside, we were covered under the Miami-Dade County water restrictions, so I'm not sure if we would be, the attorney would have to opine already under the Lee County, and it might not be necessary to do, but that's totally up to this elected body. Usually Lee County, since that's where we get our water from.
I would think Steve would know that, wouldn't he? It's coming from Lee County. We could ask our utilities director.
Correct. We'll find
But I
out.
think though,
You can ask
the Water Management District is trying to get all the different municipalities to adopt this. So that tells me that it's not a countywide thing. We have our own ordinance.
Same thing over there, 33 cities, they wanted all of them to do it, but because the county did it, that's where the water all came from, it was covered. We were automatically under that policy, but we can do anything we want to do. It was
No,
just,
but
our
it-
attorney advised us, you didn't need to do it, so that's just where we were. I'd leave it to
Oh,
Becky.
I had not heard that. Becky.
No, not Becky, not Becky, my
you're a-
previous
oh,
attorney.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay.
And I don't know, yeah, it's interesting because I don't know what the ramifications are. If we have a redundant ordinance that we just get rid of and then the county supersedes us, maybe that would do it, but then it means that I think if it's not our ordinance, then we can't enforce it.
Yeah, that's part of it.
If I may just add a bit here, the Water Management District includes all of Southwest Florida. So these other municipalities have already gone on board. We're kind of like a lagger on that. So basically that's doing for irrigation, that's doing for misuse of water, is trying to be more of a conservative type function to not put pollutants into our waterways, things like that. And so that's kind of what the Water Management District is kind of really enforcing here.
If we could just see a red line of that, I think it seems worth considering, yeah.
Yes, sir.
Anything else for Chad?
And I don't recall the changes being significant in that ordinance. Pretty trivial.
Very good. Thank you, Chad.
So my nickname in high school was Tree, but I'm not 10 foot tall, so I'd be a sprout.
Whatever you want.
Be careful. Nicknames have a way of sticking, John. Oh, Sprout. Should we say Sprout?
Sprout.
You need some irony in there. Agenda management. Counselor Veach.
Okay, well, some of this I had on the list to talk about at Monday's meeting, but a couple things that came up that I'd like either we started working on or some clarification. Now, there was an announcement over the summer about the temporary use permit and requiring an update of that every 6 months, and a fee. And I understand the fee is temporarily been waived. But it brings up a couple of questions to me. Is like, one is, okay, if someone is applying for a temporary use permit and that requires electrical or plumbing to hook up their trailer, then in my mind that should not be part of the 50% rule, because everything that's being done is for a temporary structure.
Counselor Veach, I would yield, I think it's a great question. I would yield to Becky because I believe the legislature passed something that says that you can't come, it has extended the temporary use for what, 36 months?
Mhm.
And I'm curious as to how that impacts our flexibility to play in that sandbox.
Okay. Yes, I believe our code has, 12 months and then some extensions to it, up to 3 years, I believe.
I think it was like 6 months to 18.
Or 6 months, okay.
Not sure.
Oh, that's right, yeah. But we can't do that anymore because we can't stop people from having them for the full 3 years. Now, they have to, I think that it would be a good idea to have them come in and basically re-up the permit. We couldn't turn them down, but we could check to make sure that in fact they were complying with the state law, which requires them to be proceeding to rebuild.
Andy, isn't that what you were already contemplating? Or?
Correct. Yes.
Do you want to opine on that,
I'll teach you
Andy?
a side conversation.
Becky, will you repeat?
Okay,
We
sure.
were, but yes,
Okay.
I know what she was talking about, the 6 months, the renewal, but.
Yes. Okay. Well, it's my recommendation that you won't be able to turn them down unless they aren't, the state statute says that they can maintain the temporary, whatever it is they're living in, for a total of 3 years.
Right.
But that is while they are attempting to take steps to rebuild. So I don't see a problem with requiring them, for instance, every 6 months to re-up and, let you know what they are doing to rebuild. And, it may take a really long, it will take a really long time because there is a finite number of people who are going to be doing the construction and that sort of thing. But I presume that the reason you had a limit of 18 months is you didn't want these things to become permanent fixtures.
Correct, and that's exactly what we're planning, and some other things it's even, several things we're looking at because they should be kind of like grandfathered. It's through no fault of their own these situations were created, so we're trying to be as user-friendly as we can for the residents and not require them to, pay the fee first of all. But we need to track it to make sure we know what's there and what the progress is.
Just my 2 cents, I'm okay with tracking, but I think since state law entitles them to 36 months, I think making somebody come in every 6 months is probably too onerous. I would go to a year at the least. But to Councilor Veach's point, are you saying, Mr. Town Manager, that you're already I guess between Councilor Veach and the Town Manager, does this need to be on the M&P agenda, or are you already managing this, or?
Well, I think it does, just to make sure we codify it and put it in play as a temporary.
Well, a lot of it, to me, also be just kind of a policy thing saying that we're not going to push this. And the other thing is the 50% rule, that if someone, there's people like the Lowrys or like frankly me or other people who have some usable structure that they're going to tear down. But right now it's usable, and anything that's been, and if you want to hook up sewer to your trailer, if the 50% rule calculation comes in, it becomes problematical. So I think that if someone is doing, some work just for a trailer, which is kind of intended for, that should not be subject to the calculation for the 50% rule because it's not permanent. It's not going to be there in FEMA's eyes.
Do you want to put it on the M&P agenda then? Is that what you're suggesting?
I don't know, maybe that's a policy we can just discuss here. I don't know if it, because it's such a temporary thing, I'm not really sure if it's something we need to go the full legislative process on.
It's up to this group. If the attorney says I can do it, I'll do it. We could bring it back to every meeting, but I'm happy to implement that, but I want full authority to do that, not, oh, wait a minute, you shouldn't have done that, because there's some other things we'll look at too that could really take a lot of time, and Frank and I are starting to look at some of these things, and it could be that if we have to wait, to the next meeting to bring it up to get an approval, that could just delay the time. It's some things that don't just crop up as the day goes along. Oh, wow, we should have addressed that. And so we have to delay to get to an M&P meeting or to a regular council meeting. So however you want me to handle these situations, to give me the authority to have those, as long as it's not, changing the course of our town, I think there's some reasonable things that we work with.
And I would agree with giving you some leeway there. I think that, you understand the whole interaction with, we don't want to do anything that's against FEMA's rules. But if it's a simple thing and it's a temporary thing, then we don't want to make it cumbersome for people.
I
And
agree with that.
I did have a conversation with FEMA regarding, because when they saw that we had adopted a new ordinance regarding renewing the application, they actually said that they appreciated that we did that, because that's a good way for them to re-talk with people and say, where are you? What are you doing in your process? And you need to sign this now, and this is the timeline you're on, so that it's a good way for them to be in touch with them regularly and make sure that they're on their path to getting into a better position. So FEMA thought it was a good thing that we did that, from the discussions that I've had.
Okay, I think we're going to yield to the town manager on this. Counselor Veach, anything else?
Yeah, the other thing that came up, and this is something that I see Steve is sitting here, that I've heard different things on, because with the November change in the flood maps, we have V zone, we have an A zone, we also have a coastal A zone. And I've heard different interpretations to that. When I read a FEMA document, they said that they recommended you treat coastal A similar to V, but that to me recommended means not necessarily. And I'm just wondering, if we need to get maybe some interpretation to what it means if you're in the coastal A zone, what it is you can do now that you couldn't do before, or what it is that you can't do now that you used to be able to. Is there anything concrete that we're into for that?
Sure. Steve Poposky, Community Development Director, Building Official. The Florida Building Code has certain requirements for coastal A. There's also a couple of exemptions that they've carved out. For example, in a coastal A. So the simplest way I can put it without going into great detail is that coastal A is a lot like a V zone. It's treated that way under the building code, except that there's a couple of exceptions, like you can build with a backfilled stem wall as long as the engineering accounts for wave action and local scour. But essentially, you're talking in most cases like an open foundation, similar to like a V zone.
So does that mean that it's the same restrictions below flood as far as only access and parking, or?
Yeah, so you think of the acronym SPA, S-P-A. So storage, limited storage, parking, or building access. Building access might be like a staircase or maybe an elevator. And although you can put in enclosures of certain sizes in these zones, it's not recommended because your flood insurance will be considerably higher. It could be 10 times as much.
And when I was first hearing this, because I understand that the coastal A zone, some of it's carved out of V zone, what used to be V zone. Some of it's carved out of what is A zone. But with these restrictions, I'm really concerned about what it means for someone who has a commercial property in a coastal A zone, because the V zone is so difficult to put commercial property on.
Yeah, it's the most restrictive zone, V zone, and then coastal A is next, less restrictive, and then A zone, and then X. We don't have any X outside the flood. This entire island is on the flood, is in a special flood hazard area, so it's at least an A. And then what they did in November 17 was they added, among some other revisions to the map, they added that coastal A zone. So that makes anything on the map, it's kind of a black line and has some arrows pointed towards the sea. So anything seaward of that line is now in a coastal A, which makes it very much like a V. Not exactly, but very much like that.
Now, are you getting a lot of surprised commercial people who are thinking they're just going to build back like they did and they can't?
We're getting a few. We have some notable examples. Some people have run into it where they were in an A and now they're in a coastal A, and their building has to meet these regulations, and it's just an uncomfortable situation. But like I said, it's something that's adopted through federal. It comes from federal. It's in the state building code. It's in our floodplain ordinance.
I think I would maybe be a good idea with council's concurrence to have put out some kind of press release explaining this to people, so they maybe know in advance what the effects of this November floodplain map changes are.
I think it's probably a good idea. There's some really good guides that we put on the website. There's one called Quick Guide to Floodplain Regulations in Florida. It's in what I created a site called the Resource Library. And so if you go to the website, FMB.gov, and then you go to the permitting page, and on the left side there's a resource library link. And you click on that and you'll get more information probably than you even wanted to know. But in there's that quick guide, and it really gives a good graphical, representation of some of these ideas and what it means, instead of reading through a code book, which is,
Well, that's a good link that could be in a press release
yeah.
to people.
You did say, though, that some of these things are arbitrary, if you will. If, it may cost you more flood insurance money, but there still would be legal if you choose to do it, correct?
So the example I used was an enclosure. So like in a V zone, if you want to put in an enclosure, even a breakaway walls, and it has to have breakaway walls.
Mm-hmm.
But even if you put in breakaway walls, your insurance will still be higher. They just, for whatever reason, putting any kind of enclosure from an insurance standpoint, just an FYI, they do consider that an enclosure, even though it's a breakaway. So your rates will be higher. You're allowed to do it under those regulations. For example, like, lattice work, and you got to have a flood vent in there now as well.
So that's not something that we would say no to. It's just understanding you will be charged.
Yeah, we try to we try to mention that, just because a lot of times people realize like, well, they want what's the minimum, and so they build to the minimum, but they don't realize like down the road they're going to pay more, even though it's legal. It's because insurance doesn't always like it.
Yeah, you're going to pay somebody sometime.
Anything additional?
Yeah, I'm sorry. There's a few things here that have been coming up over the holiday break. The other thing that one of the biggest email complaints that we've all been getting is being charged for putting down rock or fill. And I think again that would probably be maybe a good PR thing to say, because when you put fill on your property, you are potentially flooding your neighbors. And then if you go too far, then you might have to really change your plans because of it. So I think that, and a lot of people, they're putting down rock, maybe not realizing that that's probably considered fill, and that there's some rules applying that. So I think it's again we could reach out to people and explain what it means when you put down something on your property. Why are the rules there, and what can you do?
Good point. I think as a very blanket statement, with some exceptions, development activity, if you're adding something to your property in a way that you really should, if you're not sure, go ahead and stop by, or let us know. We'll help you out with is there a regulation, is there a permit? Generally there is. And this entire island's in a special flood hazard area, and the federal regulations, it feeds through all the way down to our ordinance, where they have certain requirements that our ordinance says certain things, and then our ordinance says that. And one of those things is that when you're adding that fill, that material to this special flood hazard area, you need a permit for it. And essentially that's exactly what you said, is because it can and will impact potentially your neighbors. So there's certain requirements that, if you think about, if everybody just went and dropped, 40 yards of fill on their property, all of a sudden people that wouldn't have been flooded already are now flooded in the next storm. So that's kind of the concern. That's kind of why it exists.
Okay, and then one more thing, and this is just kind of an idea. I just want to get council's feel if there's something I should pursue. And the idea was, we're coming up in our budget time about the parking rates, that I would like, and I'm asking this because it might take some staff time, is if we can come up with a way to come up with like a validation parking, so that people who come and go to a restaurant and spend X number of dollars can then get some kind of credit on the parking app for parking, some reduction in their parking rates. I'm using this as an alternative to say we're just going to reduce parking rates, because the argument for reducing parking rates is to help the businesses. But if someone is coming down with their cooler and going to a beach access and not shopping anywhere, it's really not affecting businesses. And that would be us subsidizing somebody who was not affected by the hurricane. So if there's consensus in council, just see if there's an easy way we can come up with a validation, so that people go to a restaurant or a shop, spend so much money that they'll get a QR code or something they would use the app for, and get some of their parking fees back, or get a reduction in the parking rate.
Is your request to put that on an M&P?
It's really, we're on an M&P now. I think that it's really a matter of, I'm not sure how possible it is. I don't know what the what the capabilities of the website or the app that we're using now is. So I'm not sure if this is something that we can do easily, or whether it's something that would take us reinventing the wheel. So before we really want to consider it, I'd just like the approval of council to maybe work with staff to go through this app, talk to the people who provide it, and see if this is something that's doable. But if it's not an idea that council doesn't want, then I'm not going to take the time and staff time to do it.
Personally, I would support that, and I'm not sure, though, if there's a legal ramification for that, or...
I would certainly, in the interest of time, I would support the exploration of the concept.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't see a legal problem with that at all.
Okay, thank you.
You know, along those lines, though, I still think our app is not working. And we bring this up all the time because we're getting more emails that say they went in, they did the addition of time, they still got a ticket because it didn't show up. So I don't know who's in charge of checking that out, but we really need to get that resolved.
Well, I don't know if this is the right time or place, but that we've had some restructuring in our organization, and some of these divisions and departments have been shifted around as far as management. Actually, Frank, he has beach and street enforcement at this point. So, fortunately, he's right here. And
We are currently town-wide are addressing our software shortfalls. We've been working with a lot of antiquated software throughout each department, from the records keeping and records request with the clerk's office all the way down to finance and HR. So what we have done is started back about 2 months ago. We started an initiative to sit down, start general discussions. Since I also take care of the procurement end of it, we've been meeting with the directors and kind of putting together little packages of what they think that they could get and use and utilize over the next maybe 5-year period. Council already had given us a blessing to go ahead and pursue updated software, and that's kind of what we started the initial conversations, and this is falling into that category.
Frank, could you, just for the folks that are still hanging in there, could you state your full name and your new title for the public?
Well, the title seems to change on a daily basis, but my name is Frankie Kropacek, and I'm the Operations and Compliance Director for the town of Fort Myers Beach.
Very good, thank you.
And this is not really an item, but there's sometimes there's conflict, and we can't always get Sarah. We used to have Jason Green coming in, and he was sidelined for some reason. I'm not really sure why, but I'd just like to give him authorization to again act in his role and present to council. I think if we have a time when we can't get Sarah or whatever, I think that he's a very smart guy, and I'd like to get him back into the conversation.
sounds good to me. Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah, again, this is agenda management. I'm happy to have folks put extracurricular activities on here, which are been very helpful, but these are items that council would like to see on the next M&P schedule, or at least at some point an M&P calendar. Councilor Woodson?
The one thing that we've talked about, and it still sits at the bottom of the list, is the Veterans Tribute to Bayside Park, at Bayside Park. And we're getting really close, seems like. We're 30 days out, maybe less, of Bayside Park, so I think that really needs to move up.
Now, that is an issue that a previous council had a suggestion on that I think we reached consensus on. But obviously, post-storm, it's kind of sat there. As I understand it, Mr. Town Manager or Mr. Director of Operations, I understand that the land parcel or the portion of the park, we're still setting aside that space for a Veterans Memorial. Is that correct? And again, the solution that the previous council agreed to, which was something I had put forward, was to have a quote from JFK as well as a quote from Ronald Reagan in support of our military veterans. And then we talked about having those quotes put on a stone that would be designed and put together by the gentleman who designed the Vietnam Memorial, who happens to live in Sanibel. and is a good friend of our CellCab chair, Barbara Hill. I think the reason why that languished is we assigned a resident to help gather the funds from the veterans community, and it just never gathered the momentum that I think we'd hoped. And again, given the post-Ian environment, hopefully maybe we could potentially find some funding for that. I think I've heard you guys already describe finding significant economies as you rebuild Bayside Park. If there could be some funds that could be set aside, and we had a budget to work with on that piece of the puzzle. I think, Mr. Town Manager, I think you're going to be meeting with Barbara Hill at some point. I think maybe if Frank could be part of that, and then we could begin to move that idea forward. We obviously won't be ready by the opening of Bayside
Right.
Park, but at least to Councilor Woodson's point, we could kind of get that thing moving. And I still have the quotes, which I can get to you guys, that were agreed to. Obviously, want to make sure Councilor Woodson and Councilor King are okay with the quotes. I thought they were pretty solid, personally, but I'll make sure, I'll try to get that to you as well. But that's kind of where that was, and that's why it kind of languished. Anything else?
No, there was mention of shade meetings. Do we have any idea when that might be coming up? In
I don't know. I think it will be at the next town council meeting when I will be requesting it. But I have not had the in-depth discussion with the attorneys for the, with the League of Cities.
Okay, I was just curious.
Yeah,
I wanted to get it on my calendar
I
if
was
we had
thinking that I
something.
might, do it today, but I don't have the dates yet.
John, anything you'd like to add to the M&P calendar?
I have nothing.
I have nothing additional. I just would restate my, the item I had on Monday, which is really kind of an M&P item, I believe, and that's to get the staff and our town attorney to put together some ideas. I'd like to put it on the M&P town clerk for some guidance for staff, so they can have some guidance to utilize an administrative variance or administrative deviation, however you want to term it, in instances that could help expedite the process. I've discussed it with staff. They're open to the idea, but they would, I think understandably, ask for some guidance. The example I used is that we've all heard it. We have we have a constituent who is very active in the community who was trying to get a fence permitted, and it was the same fence that they had before the storm, and they were told they needed a variance, and they asked if it could be done administratively, and they said, no, you've got to use a variance. And I think that would be an example of a type of administrative variance we'd like to empower staff to have. I'm sure there's a litany of other ones. Sarah, I'm sure you've got a lot of ideas. Steve, I'm sure has some wonderful ideas. But if we need to have an M&P to discuss that, that'd be great. If not, staff wants to come forward, or if Becky wants to come forward, however you want to handle it.
I can draft something for that, because I think that will make the rebuilding process just so much easier.
Great. Open for, if the public's listening, if there's some land use folks out there, or folks that have run into challenges that would have preferred to have things done administratively, or just a few inches here and there, open for suggestions.
And I think, the only ramification of that is you make sure that by saying you're going to allow X, Y, and Z administratively, you're not effectively making it like part of the code. You know what I mean? There's still got to be some.
Yep, fair point.
Okay, there is a provision in your code right now for administrative variances. It is not a matter of right, and it does require the person who is administratively handling that to make a decision, and there's a tick list of what needs to be decided, including that it will not, for instance, hurt the neighbors, that it is in compliance with the overall feel of the code. Basically, it's in conformance with the comp plan, and it does put limitations on them.
I think, Becky, when I talked to Steve, and I want to speak for Steve, but he was looking for some guidance and specific examples of when the council would feel an administrative code would be appropriate, so he and his team feel like they're in concert with the council on the specific use of the administrative variance.
Then I think that it would be a good idea to have it put on the next agenda.
On the M&P?
Yes.
Let's do that then.
Yes, and then we can have a full discussion, and then he can be comfortable with actually using the power that he already has.
Very good. Are you good with that, Steve? You can, I mean, if you want. It's important, it's an important issue. I want to make sure you're comfortable.
So the setback, the variances that are allowable right now are for setbacks. It's kind of a very, very narrow thing, and I'm willing to listen, and if it's the council's, will to do certain things, we'll do it that way. No problem. I think we should come to an agreement about what that is. I think in some cases we're talking about a fence that it's not compliant with the code, so at some point, do we want to just change the code? I mean, we had the discussion later. If we're happy with a certain height fence, then maybe we just change the code to allow it so that everyone can build the same way.
Steve, on that, just, I don't want to belabor the meeting, but that, and I don't know all the details of that case, but if the fence is exactly the same as, maybe it needed a variance before the storm and it was gotten, and now after the storm to replace the exact same fence, is it, or is the example different than that?
I believe we're talking about the same one, where there's like, for example, in a front yard where, okay, at some point there was a variance granted for it. But again, it's not even so much, it's not just the variance, it's the fact that the permit needs to be in place just to figure out, make sure it's in the right place and it's compliant, but two separate issues.
So more of a compliance concern than
A little bit of both. I mean, first you have to have the permit to make sure it's in the right place, it's the right color, we don't know necessarily exactly what you had, in all cases. And then as far as the variance, I mean, and it's an ask to, put taller than, say, a 42-inch fence if you want to put in a 6-foot in the front yard right along the street. The LDC doesn't allow it, so that would be something you'd have to carve out, which we certainly could do, but it's just...
You're on the front lines, obviously, I just would encourage you over the next few weeks as we're thinking about this, if you and your team feel like this could be helpful tool with council's guidance and support, you can find some examples where, gosh, I wish we had the ability to, or at least the direction to utilize this administrative variance and the support. Just think about opportunities to utilize that, where it makes sense and where you think it would be helpful to you and speed the process.
There's situations, and maybe we'll have a longer discussion, but sometimes people they really want to put their house a certain orientation on the lot. It's not a huge lot. It's not sort of a standard lot. They really want it this way because they want the view and whatever. And if that's the will of the council to put it to have a minimum of, say, 5-foot setbacks on all sides, including the front along the street, then we'll do it that way. But typically, you're going to have a bigger front setback, and that's the way the code reads. So
you're not running into situations where there's just 6 inches here, and gosh, if we could just, do we have to go all
No,
over?
it's not like that. It's like the code requires 25 feet, and you want 6 feet off the front street.
Okay.
And again, if that's what we want to do, we're fine with it. We just need a little bit of direction.
No, I think we're under the impression that there's these small tweaks that all of a sudden, because the code is inflexible, that they've got to go through this big variance hurdle where if we just use common sense, or the staff could say, gosh, you're just over 6 inches, but maybe those situations don't exist. That's the perception I think that we have.
I think so, yeah. Some of that is, yeah, there's a little bit of leeway, but it's not as, I don't think this is situations we're talking about in these two examples.
Okay.
There are some exceptions, like if you want to put a bay window out and it's clearly not going to affect your neighbor, you come out 12 inches out of your, past the set, so that's an example that's allowed.
Okay.
You can't add a whole story to your house, that's clearly not allowed, and it's spelled out that way. So yeah, maybe we flesh it out a little more and just come up with some specifics, like if anybody's seeing a lot of them, hearing a lot, like, hey, I want to, whatever it may be.
Okay. Well, that'll be a good opportunity for food for thought at an M&P in the future. Did you have something, Councilor Beach? Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, listen, some of the devil's in the details. Are we issuing many administrative variances now?
I just did one yesterday. We did one, I remember, I recall at least 2. There hasn't been a lot of requests.
And
But
so what were they for?
one was for placement of a house on a small lot. That was yesterday. And, God, I can't remember what the other one was for. Oh, it was for the orientation of the house. It was a kind of an odd shaped lot as well. And there was, it sort of met the requirements that were in the checklist that we had in the LDCs for something that could be an admin variance depending. And again, it's, as Becky mentioned, is that, it says that you have to have certain findings of fact, and that's sometimes a little hard to, maybe we should talk about what that means. Maybe later, but that would really help to know how are we defining a finding of fact? Does that mean that if you get, a letter from everybody, around you, that borders your property that says, I'm okay with this, does that mean it's not affecting the other people? Or, at some point we come up with a standard, we can meet that and make it sort of fair for everyone.
Yeah, and I think that's something to me that sounds like it kind of makes sense, saying that if you have something that is normally not an administrative variance, but you've got concurrence with all your neighbors, then maybe you get a little bit more leeway.
Sounds great. Let's put all that in our M&P conversation, Becky, and Steve, just continue to give that some thought. Appreciate your comments. Anything else for the good of the order today? Do we have a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
We are adjourned.
That seemed positively sluggish, Karen.
I was just laughing because